This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. I froze for a moment, not expecting anyone. Cautiously, I approached the door and looked through the peephole. There was a man in a dark suit standing there, holding some kind of badge or ID card. "Hotel inspection," he called out in a clipped, official-sounding tone. "Please open the door." I hesitated, my hand on the doorknob. Something felt off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Still, he had shown a badge, and I didn't want to cause any trouble. Slowly, I opened the door, keeping the security latch in place. The man flashed his badge quickly, too quickly for me to get a good look, but I caught the word "Inspector" on it. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with close-cropped gray hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look right through me. "Good evening, ma'am," he said briskly. "We're conducting a routine inspection of all rooms on this floor. I'll need to come in and take a look around. It should only take a few minutes." I frowned, still not opening the door fully. At this hour, I wasn't notified of any inspection. He gave me a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's a surprise inspection, ma'am, to ensure everything is up to code. I assure you it's standard procedure." Something in his tone made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. But what could I do? He had a badge, and if I refused, I might get in trouble with the hotel. Reluctantly, I closed the door to undo the latch, then opened it wide. The man strode in confidently, his eyes sweeping the room. "Please remain by the door while I conduct my inspection," he instructed. I stood there awkwardly in my pajamas as he moved methodically through the room. He checked the smoke detector, inspected the windows, and even looked under the bed. But then things took a strange turn. He went to my suitcase, which was open on the luggage rack, and started rifling through it. "Hey," I protested, "that's my personal property. You can't go through that." He barely glanced at me. "All areas of the room must be inspected, ma'am, including guests' belongings, hotel policy." My heart was pounding now. This didn't feel right at all. I watched in growing alarm as he pawed through my clothes, opened my toiletry bag, and even flipped through a folder of work documents. "I really don't think this is appropriate," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "I'd like to call the front desk to confirm this inspection." His head snapped up, those icy blue eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, I saw something dangerous flash across his face before his expression smoothed back into bland professionalism. "That won't be necessary," he said coolly. "I'm almost finished here." But instead of wrapping up, he moved to my purse on the desk and started going through it. That was the last straw. I lunged for my phone on the nightstand, but he was faster. In 2 long strides, he was across the room, grabbing my wrist in an iron grip. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," he growled, all pretense of being an inspector gone. Pure terror shot through me. I opened my mouth to scream, but he clamped his other hand over it, muffling the sound. "Now listen carefully," he hissed in my ear. "You're going to sit quietly on that bed while I finish what I came here to do. If you make a sound or try to leave, things will get very unpleasant for you. Understand?" I nodded frantically, tears streaming down my face. He released me and shoved me towards the bed. I sat there shaking as he resumed going through my belongings. My mind was racing. Who was this man? What did he want? Was he going to kill me when he was done? I had to do something, but I was paralyzed with fear. Just then, there was another knock at the door. The man's head jerked up, his eyes narrowing. "Room service," called a cheerful voice from the hallway. I hadn't ordered room service, but this was my chance. Before the man could stop me, I bolted for the door, yanking it open. There was indeed a hotel employee there with a cart of food. His eyes widened as he took in my terrified expression and the man lunging towards me from inside the room. "Help!" I screamed. "He's not really an inspector. Call security." The room service guy reacted instantly, positioning himself between me and my attacker. He yelled for help down the hallway as the fake inspector tried to push past him. What followed was a blur of action and noise. Other hotel staff came running. There was shouting and a brief scuffle. I cowered in the hallway, trembling uncontrollably, as security guards finally subdued the man who had terrorized me. The next few hours passed in a daze. Police were called. I gave a statement, my voice shaky and tears still flowing. The hotel manager was profusely apologetic, assuring me they had no idea how this man had gotten in. It turned out he wasn't the first to pull this scam. There had been reports in other cities of a man posing as a hotel inspector to gain access to rooms and rob guests. But this was the first time he'd been caught. They offered to move me to a new room, but I couldn't bear the thought of spending another night in that hotel. I packed my things and checked out immediately, my hands still shaking as I signed the paperwork. As I sat in the back of a taxi, heading to a different hotel across town, the full impact of what had happened finally hit me. I broke down sobbing, startling the driver. How close had I come to being seriously hurt, or worse? The what-ifs kept spinning through my mind. I barely slept that night, jumping at every little sound. Even after returning home, I was jumpy and paranoid for weeks. I kept replaying the incident in my mind, second-guessing every decision I'd made. It's been months now, and I still get anxious staying in hotels. I triple-check the credentials of anyone claiming to be staff before letting them in. I use every lock and security measure available, and I never, ever open the door without being 100% sure of who's on the other side. I know I'm lucky. It could have been so much worse. But the fear and violation I felt that night have left deep scars. I don't know if I'll ever feel completely safe in a hotel room again. To anyone reading this, please be careful. Trust your instincts if something feels off. Don't be afraid to double-check with the front desk. And always, always prioritize your safety over politeness or avoiding a scene. I shudder to think what might have happened if that room service employee hadn't shown up when he did. It's a reminder that sometimes the smallest coincidences can make the biggest difference. I'm grateful every day for that stroke of luck and for the quick thinking of the hotel staff who came to my rescue. But I also know that I can't rely on luck to keep me safe. I've become much more vigilant about my personal security, especially when traveling. I've taken self-defense classes and always make sure someone knows my itinerary and checks in with me regularly. The police later told me that they found a set of stolen room keys and several pieces of fake ID on the man when they searched him. It seems he had been operating this scam for months, targeting women traveling alone. The thought of how many others he might have victimized before he was caught makes me sick. I've struggled with feelings of guilt and shame in the aftermath. Why did I let him in? Why didn't I trust my instincts sooner? But my therapist has helped me understand that none of this was my fault. I was the victim of a skilled predator who knew exactly how to manipulate people's trust and politeness. Still, there are moments when the fear comes rushing back. An unexpected knock on the door can send my heart racing. I've had panic attacks in hotel rooms, overwhelmed by flashbacks of that night. It's a long, slow process of healing and rebuilding my sense of safety in the world. I'm sharing this story not to scare anyone, but to warn others to be cautious. It's easy to let your guard down when you're tired from traveling or in an unfamiliar place. But please, always trust your gut. If something feels wrong, it probably is. I'm grateful every day that I survived this ordeal, and while I may never be the carefree traveler I once was, I refuse to let fear control my life. I still travel for work, still stay in hotels, but now I do it with my eyes wide open, always aware of my surroundings and trusting my instincts. To anyone who's been through a similar experience, know that you're not alone. It's okay to be scared, to be angry, to struggle with the aftermath. But with time and support, it does get better. We are survivors, and we are stronger than we know. As for the man who did this, I later learned he was convicted on multiple charges and will spend years in prison. It brings me some peace to know he can't hurt anyone else. But I also hope that he gets the help he clearly needs. No one becomes this kind of predator without some deep-seated issues of their own. In the end, this experience has changed me in profound ways. I'm more cautious, yes, but also more appreciative of the kindness of strangers like that room service employee who came to my aid. I'm more aware of my own strength and resilience, and I'm committed to using my voice to help others stay safe. If my story can help even one person avoid a similar situation, then some good will have come from that terrifying night. So please, stay safe out there. Trust your instincts, be aware of your surroundings, and never be afraid to speak up if something doesn't feel right. Your safety is always more important than being polite or avoiding a scene. And to anyone reading this who might be considering similar crimes, know that you will be caught. The fear and trauma you inflict on others will come back to haunt you. It's not too late to seek help and choose a different path. As for me, I'm still healing, still processing, but I'm also moving forward, determined not to let one horrible night define the rest of my life. I'm reclaiming my independence, my love of travel, and my trust in the fundamental goodness of most people. It's not easy, but every day I get a little stronger, a little braver. And to anyone out there who might be going through something similar, please know this: you are not alone. What happened to you is not your fault, and there is help and hope available. Reach out, speak up, and don't give up. We survivors are stronger together. That night, I was walking back to my room around 10 p.m. when I noticed something odd. The door to room 412, 2 doors down from mine, was slightly ajar. I paused, debating whether to close it or notify the front desk. As I stood there, I caught a whiff of a strange, sickly sweet odor wafting from the room. My curiosity got the better of me. I knocked gently on the doorframe. "Hello? Is everything all right in there?" No response. I pushed the door open a bit wider and peeked inside. The room was dark, illuminated only by the glow of the TV. As my eyes adjusted, I made out a shape on the bed. Someone was lying there, motionless. "Excuse me?" I called out, louder this time. Still nothing. A sense of dread crept over me as I fumbled for the light switch. When the lights flickered on, I let out an involuntary gasp. There on the bed was the body of a man, probably in his 50s, dressed in a suit. His skin had a grayish tinge, and his eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. But what really caught my attention was the dark stain spreading across his chest. I stumbled backward out of the room, my heart pounding. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? I think I've found a dead body, I stammered. At the Lakeview Hotel, room 412. The next hour passed in a blur. Police and paramedics swarmed the hotel. I was questioned repeatedly about what I'd seen and how I'd come across the body. Other guests peered out of their rooms, whispering and speculating. As the night wore on, I learned bits and pieces about the victim. His name was Robert Carlson, a pharmaceutical executive in town for a conference. The police suspected foul play. He'd been stabbed in the chest. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mr. Carlson's lifeless face. The police had asked me to stay in town for a few days in case they had more questions, so I was stuck there, 2 doors down from a crime scene. The next morning I was having coffee in the hotel lobby when a detective approached me. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Detective Reyes. I was hoping we could talk a bit more about what you saw last night." We sat down, and she pulled out a notebook. "Can you walk me through your movements yesterday evening? Any details you can remember, no matter how small, could be helpful." I took a deep breath and recounted my day. Waking up, the meetings I'd attended, grabbing a quick dinner at the hotel bar. "I ordered the club sandwich," I said. "I remember because the bartender recommended it." Detective Reyes nodded, jotting down notes. "And you didn't see or hear anything unusual throughout the day? No arguments or disturbances?" I shook my head. "No, nothing like that. It was a pretty normal day until I found Mr. Carlson." She leaned forward. "Tell me about that moment again. What made you notice the door was open?" I closed my eyes, trying to recall every detail. I was walking back to my room, checking my phone. I glanced up and saw the door wasn't fully closed. It struck me as odd because housekeeping is usually so thorough here. "And the smell? You mentioned a smell when we talked last night." I nodded. "Yeah, it was sweet, but not in a good way. Kind of sickly. I'd never smelled anything quite like it before." Detective Reyes made a few more notes, then looked up at me. "Mr. Thompson, I have to ask, did you know Robert Carlson? Had you ever met him before?" "No," I said firmly. "I'd never seen him before in my life. I'm not even in the pharmaceutical industry." She studied me for a moment, then nodded. "All right. Thank you for your time. Please don't leave town without letting us know." As she walked away, I felt a chill run down my spine. Was I a suspect? The thought hadn't even occurred to me before. The next few days were surreal. I tried to work from my hotel room, but I couldn't focus. Every sound in the hallway made me jump. I kept replaying that night in my mind, wondering if I'd missed something important. On my 4th day at the hotel, I was returning from a quick trip to a nearby coffee shop when I noticed a woman standing in front of room 412. She was in her 40s, well-dressed, with red-rimmed eyes. As I approached, she turned to me. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Did you know Robert?" I hesitated, then shook my head. "No, I'm sorry. I'm the one who found him." Her eyes widened. Oh, I see." She took a shaky breath. "I'm his wife, Linda. I needed to see where it happened." I stood there awkwardly, unsure what to say. "I'm so sorry for your loss," I finally managed. Linda nodded, wiping away a tear. "Thank you. It doesn't make sense. Robert didn't have any enemies. Who would want to hurt him?" Before I could respond, Detective Reyes appeared at the end of the hallway. "Mrs. Carlson, I'm Detective Reyes. I was hoping we could talk." As Linda walked away with the detective, I retreated to my room, my mind spinning. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was somehow involved in this, even though I knew I'd done nothing wrong. That night I was startled awake by a noise in the hallway. Groggy and disoriented, I stumbled to the door and peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty, but I could have sworn I'd heard footsteps. Just as I was about to go back to bed, I noticed something on the floor outside my door. Heart racing, I opened the door just enough to reach down and grab it. It was a small, folded piece of paper. With trembling hands, I unfolded it and read the message scrawled inside. You saw something you shouldn't have. Keep your mouth shut if you know what's good for you. I dropped the note as if it had burned me. My mind raced. Who could have left this? Was I in danger? I spent the rest of the night huddled in my room, jumping at every sound. When morning finally came, I went straight to Detective Reyes and told her about the note. She frowned as she examined it. This is a serious development, Mr. Thompson. We're going to need to put you under police protection. The next few days were a blur of police interviews and sleepless nights. I was moved to a different hotel with a police officer stationed outside my door. I felt like I was living in a crime thriller, but this was all too real. A week after I'd found Mr. Carlson's body, Detective Reyes called me into the station. As I sat across from her in the interrogation room, she slid a photo across the table. "Do you recognize this man?" she asked. I looked at the photo. It showed a man in his 30s with dark hair and a scar on his left cheek. I shook my head. "No, I've never seen him before." Detective Reyes nodded. "His name is Alex Kovacs. He's a hitman we've been tracking for months. We believe he's the one who killed Robert Carlson." I stared at her, stunned. A hitman? But why? "We've uncovered evidence that Mr. Carlson was about to blow the whistle on some illegal practices in his company. It seems someone wanted to keep him quiet." As the reality of the situation sank in, I felt a mix of relief and horror. Relief that I was no longer a suspect, but horror at the danger I'd unknowingly been in. "So what happens now?" I asked. "We're closing in on Kovacs," Detective Reyes said, "but until we catch him, you'll need to stay under protection. You're our key witness, Mr. Thompson." As I left the police station that day, I realized my life would never be the same. What had started as a routine business trip had turned into a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. Even now, months later, I still have trouble sleeping. Every time I close my eyes, I see Mr. Carlson's lifeless body. I jump at unexpected noises and constantly look over my shoulder. The police eventually caught Alex Kovacs, and I testified at his trial. But the fear lingers. I can't help but wonder, what if I hadn't noticed that open door? What if I just walked by? Would Mr. Carlson's killer have ever been caught? I don't have answers to these questions. All I know is that one moment of curiosity changed my life forever. And now, every time I stay in a hotel, I can't help but wonder what secrets might be hiding behind those closed doors. I was just looking for a quiet weekend getaway when I booked a room at the Pinewood Inn. It was a quaint little place on the outskirts of town. Nothing fancy, but it had decent reviews online. I figured I'd spend a couple days relaxing, catching up on some reading, and enjoying the fall foliage. Little did I know I was about to stumble into something far more sinister. I checked in late Friday afternoon and settled into my room on the second floor. It was a pretty standard hotel room. Queen bed, small desk, TV mounted on the wall. The decor was a bit dated, but everything seemed clean enough. I unpacked my bag and decided to freshen up before heading out to grab dinner. As I was walking across the room to the bathroom, I noticed an odd lump in the carpet near the foot of the bed. At first, I thought maybe something had gotten stuck under there, so I bent down to investigate. When I pressed on the lump, I felt something shift beneath the carpet. Curious, I peeled back the edge of the carpet, and was shocked to find a small metal hatch built into the floor. My heart started racing as I stared at the unexpected discovery. Why would there be a hidden hatch in a hotel room floor? I hesitated, wondering if I should just ignore it and go about my evening as planned. But my curiosity got the better of me. I had to know what was down there. I gripped the metal ring on the hatch and pulled. It opened with a quiet groan, revealing a dark opening and the top of a ladder leading down. A musty smell wafted up from below. Every instinct told me to close it back up and forget I ever saw it. But I couldn't resist the mystery. I grabbed my phone to use as a flashlight and cautiously began descending the ladder. It led down about 15 feet to a narrow concrete tunnel. The air was damp and chilly. I shone my light down the passage, revealing pipes and electrical conduits running along the walls. It seemed to stretch on quite a ways in both directions. My hands were shaking as I debated which way to go. To the left, the tunnel appeared to curve around toward the front of the building. To the right, it continued straight, presumably toward the back. I decided to go left, figuring that might lead toward the lobby area where I could maybe find some clues about what this tunnel system was for. As I crept along, my footsteps echoed quietly off the walls. Every few yards there were metal doors set into the sides of the tunnel, but they all appeared to be locked. I tried not to think about what might be behind them. After about 50 feet, I came to a junction where another tunnel branched off to the right. Just past it, I noticed a small black dome on the ceiling, a security camera. My blood ran cold. Someone was monitoring these tunnels. I quickly ducked back around the corner, praying I hadn't been spotted. I stood there for a moment, heart pounding, unsure what to do. Part of me wanted to race back to my room and get the hell out of there, but I was also desperate to understand what was going on. Against my better judgment, I decided to keep exploring, but much more cautiously now. I continued down the main tunnel, hyper-aware of every sound. Up ahead, I could see light spilling out from under one of the doors. As I got closer, I could hear muffled voices coming from inside. I inched up to the door and pressed my ear against it, straining to make out what they were saying. "Shipment coming in Tuesday night. We'll need extra guys on hand to move it quickly." "Got it covered. I'll have a crew ready." "Good. Can't afford any slip-ups this time. The boss is getting impatient." My mind was reeling. What kind of operation was going on down here? Drugs, weapons, human trafficking? Whatever it was clearly illegal and dangerous. I needed to get out of there and call the police. Just then I heard footsteps approaching from further down the tunnel. Panic seized me as I looked for somewhere to hide. There was an alcove a few feet back that looked like it might conceal me. I ducked into it just as two men rounded the corner, engrossed in conversation. "Telling you, man, that new girl is trouble. She asks too many questions." "Relax. The boss vetted her himself. She's solid." They passed by without noticing me, but I could barely breathe. This was way more serious than I'd imagined. I had to get out of there immediately. I waited until their footsteps faded, then quickly made my way back toward the ladder to my room. But as I rounded the final corner, my heart stopped. There was a man standing at the base of the ladder, looking up at the open hatch. He was dressed all in black and had a gun holstered at his hip. I froze, trying to figure out what to do. There was no way past him to get back to my room, and any second he was going to turn around and see me. Making a split-second decision, I turned and ran back the way I'd come. I heard a shout behind me and then heavy footsteps in pursuit. Adrenaline surged through me as I sprinted down the tunnel, no longer caring about stealth. I took random turns, praying I'd find another way out. But the tunnels all looked the same, and I quickly became disoriented. I could hear multiple sets of footsteps now, coming from different directions. They were trying to box me in. I was gasping for breath, my legs burning as I pushed myself to keep running. Up ahead I saw a metal door that was slightly ajar. With no other options, I ducked inside and pulled it closed behind me. I found myself in some kind of storage room, dimly lit by a single bulb. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with boxes and crates. I looked around desperately for another exit, but there was none. I was trapped. Outside, I could hear my pursuers getting closer. They were calling out to each other, coordinating their search. It was only a matter of time before they found me. I wedged myself behind some crates, trying to control my ragged breathing. My mind raced, searching for some way out of this nightmare. Suddenly the door burst open. Flashlight beams swept across the room as two men entered. "Check behind those crates. He's got to be in here somewhere." I pressed myself flat against the wall, willing myself to disappear. Footsteps approached my hiding spot. This was it. I was about to be discovered. Just then, a voice crackled over a radio. "All units, we have a situation in the lobby. Multiple police cars just pulled up outside. Abort search and initiate cleanup protocol immediately." "Shit," one of the men cursed. "Let's go." They hurried out of the room, slamming the door behind them. I stayed frozen in place, hardly daring to breathe. For several minutes I heard frantic activity in the tunnels outside, shouting, running footsteps, slamming doors. Then gradually it grew quiet. I don't know how long I stayed huddled there in the dark. It felt like hours. Eventually, I worked up the courage to emerge from my hiding spot. I cracked open the door and peered out into the tunnel. It appeared to be deserted. Moving as quietly as I could, I retraced my steps back toward my room. When I reached the ladder, I half expected someone to be waiting for me. But the area was clear. I scrambled up the rungs and practically dove through the hatch, slamming it shut behind me. I threw my few belongings into my bag and ran out of the room, not even bothering to check out. I got in my car and drove for hours, putting as much distance between me and that place as possible. To this day, I have no idea what exactly was going on in those tunnels. Some kind of organized crime operation, clearly, but the specifics remain a mystery. I did eventually contact the police and give an anonymous tip. They raided the hotel a few weeks later and shut it down. The news reports were pretty vague on the details, but apparently they uncovered evidence of a major criminal enterprise operating out of the building's secret basement levels. It's been months now, but I still have nightmares about those tunnels. The feeling of being hunted, trapped with no escape. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, half convinced I can hear footsteps approaching in the dark. I don't know if I'll ever fully shake the trauma of that night, but I'm grateful to have made it out alive, with a story that seems almost too terrifying to be true. I still remember that day like it was yesterday. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway, just a quick trip to clear my head after a stressful few weeks at work. I had booked a room at this quaint little hotel in a small town a few hours from the city. Nothing fancy, just a place to unwind for a couple days. When I first checked in on Friday evening, everything seemed normal. The front desk clerk was friendly enough, if a bit distracted. He handed me my key card and directed me to my room on the 3rd floor. I remember thinking the hallways seemed eerily quiet as I made my way up, but I chalked it up to it being the off-season. My room was simple but comfortable, just a bed, small desk, and attached bathroom. I unpacked my overnight bag, took a quick shower, and settled in for the night with a book. At some point, I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, I was waking up in total darkness. At first, I was just disoriented from being jolted awake, but as my eyes adjusted, a feeling of dread started to creep over me. Something wasn't right. The room felt different, larger somehow, and the air had a musty, stale quality that hadn't been there before. I fumbled around for the bedside lamp but couldn't seem to find it. My hand brushed against an unfamiliar texture, rough, peeling wallpaper instead of the smooth painted walls from earlier. Panic started to set in as I realized I had no idea where I was. Scrambling out of bed, I felt my way along the wall until I found a light switch. When I flipped it on, my blood ran cold. This was definitely not the room I had fallen asleep in. It was at least twice the size, with dated floral wallpaper and heavy velvet curtains. The furniture was all antique-looking wood pieces, nothing like the modern decor from before. My first thought was that I must still be dreaming. I pinched myself hard, willing myself to wake up, but the room remained stubbornly solid and real around me. My next frantic thought was that someone must have moved me in my sleep. But why? And how? I rushed to the window and yanked open the curtains, half expecting to see some alien landscape. But no, it was the same small-town view as before, though it seemed I was now on a higher floor. The sky outside was just beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. Turning back to the room, I realized with growing horror that all my belongings were gone. My suitcase, my clothes, my phone, everything had vanished. I was dressed only in the t-shirt and shorts I had worn to bed. Fighting down the urge to scream, I tried to think logically. There had to be a rational explanation for this. Maybe there had been some kind of emergency in the night and they had to move guests to different rooms. But then why take all my things? And why put me in this bizarrely outdated room? I decided my best bet was to go down to the front desk and demand answers. Steeling myself, I opened the door and peered out into the hallway. It was dimly lit and deserted, the faded carpet and peeling wallpaper matching the decor of my room. This definitely wasn't the same modern, well-maintained hotel I had checked into. As I made my way downstairs, a chill ran through me. The whole place seemed abandoned. No sounds of other guests, no staff members in sight. When I reached the lobby, it was like stepping back in time. Gone was the sleek modern decor, replaced by heavy wooden furniture and dusty potted plants. The front desk was empty. I rang the bell, the shrill sound echoing ominously through the silent lobby. After a moment, a door behind the desk creaked open, and an elderly man shuffled out. He peered at me suspiciously through thick glasses. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. I tried to keep my own voice steady as I explained the situation, telling him about checking in the night before and waking up in a different room. As I spoke, the man's expression grew increasingly confused and alarmed. "I'm sorry, miss, but that's not possible," he said slowly. "I've been the night manager here for 40 years. We haven't had any guests check in for months. The hotel's been closed for renovations since last fall." My mind reeled. That couldn't be right. I clearly remembered checking in, unpacking my things. I described the modern lobby, the friendly young clerk who had given me my key, but the old man just shook his head. "You must be mistaken," he insisted. "This hotel has looked like this for decades. We've never had the kind of modern amenities you're describing." Desperation rising, I asked to see the guest registry. Surely my name would be there, proof that I wasn't crazy. The man reluctantly pulled out a dusty ledger and flipped through it, but page after page was blank. "See here," he said, showing me the empty pages. "No check-ins for months. Are you sure you have the right hotel?" I felt like I was losing my mind. How could there be no record of me? Where were my things? What was happening to me? The man was eyeing me warily now, clearly unsure what to make of my wild story. "Perhaps you'd like me to call someone for you," he offered hesitantly. "Family or friends who might be looking for you." But I had no phone, no wallet, no way to contact anyone. And who would believe me anyway? I could barely believe what was happening myself. In a daze, I wandered back upstairs to the room I had woken up in. I kept expecting to turn a corner and find myself back in the modern hotel from the night before. But everywhere I looked was the same faded, old-fashioned decor. I spent the next few hours searching every inch of the room and hallway, desperately hoping to find some trace of my belongings or some clue to explain what had happened. But there was nothing. As the day wore on, my initial panic gave way to a kind of numb disbelief. I kept replaying the events of the previous night in my mind, trying to find some hint I had missed. But my memories remained stubbornly clear. I knew I had checked into a modern hotel. I knew I had fallen asleep in a different room. None of this made any sense. The elderly manager checked on me a few times, clearly torn between concern and suspicion. He offered me some clothes from the lost and found, and brought up a tray of food which I could barely touch. I overheard him making a phone call, likely to the police or maybe a hospital. I knew how crazy my story must sound to him. As night fell again, I found myself standing at the window, staring out at the darkening sky. The town looked the same as it had the day before, lights coming on in windows, a few cars moving along the streets. But somehow everything felt subtly wrong, like I was looking at it all through warped glass. I must have dozed off at some point, exhaustion finally overcoming my jangled nerves. When I jolted awake again, sunlight was streaming through the window. For a blissful moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare. But as I took in the unfamiliar room around me, reality came crashing back, except something was different. The heavy velvet curtains were gone, replaced by simple white blinds. The wallpaper had vanished, the walls now a neutral beige. Heart pounding, I leapt out of bed and ran to open the door. The hallway outside was bright and modern, exactly as I remembered from my first night. I raced downstairs, hardly daring to hope. But there it was, the sleek contemporary lobby, a young woman behind the desk tapping away at a computer. She looked up as I approached, concern crossing her face. "Miss, are you all right? You seem upset." I tried to explain what had happened, the words tumbling out in a confused rush. The clerk listened with growing alarm, then quickly pulled up something on her computer. "I'm so sorry, but I'm not seeing any record of your check-in," she said. "Are you sure it was this hotel? We don't have any rooms that match the description of where you say you woke up." My heart sank. Was I going crazy? Had I imagined the whole thing? But it had felt so real. The clerk must have seen the distress on my face, because her expression softened. "Tell you what, why don't you describe the room you think you checked into originally? Maybe there was some kind of mix-up in our system." I described the room in detail, the layout, the furnishings, even the view from the window. As I spoke, the clerk's eyes widened. That sounds exactly like room 305, she said slowly. "But that's impossible. That room has been under renovation for months. No one should have been able to check in there." She pulled up something else on her computer, then gasped. "This can't be right. According to our system, room 305 was rented out last night, but there's no guest name attached, no payment info. It's like the computer glitched and created a phantom booking." I felt a chill run down my spine. What did it all mean? Had I somehow slipped between realities in the night? Or was there some more sinister explanation? The clerk called her manager, and soon the hotel was buzzing with staff trying to figure out what had happened. They found my suitcase in a storage closet with no record of how it got there. Room 305 showed no signs of having been used, despite the system claiming it was occupied. In the end, no one could explain what had happened to me. The police were called, reports were filed, but there were no answers. I checked out that day in a daze, my mind still reeling. It's been months now, and I still don't know what to make of it all. Was it all just an extremely vivid dream? Some kind of mental break? Or did I really experience something beyond normal explanation? All I know is that I've never been able to shake the feeling that for one night I slipped into some other version of reality. A place where time and space don't quite work the way we think they do. And I can't help but wonder, what if it happens again? My name is Max Turner, and I'm a traveling salesman. I spend most of my time on the road, hopping from one generic hotel to another. It was supposed to be just another routine business trip, but it turned into the most terrifying experience of my life. I arrived at the Hillside Inn late on a Tuesday night. The neon sign flickered weakly in the darkness, casting an eerie glow over the nearly empty parking lot. As I pulled up, I noticed only a handful of other cars scattered about. Not unusual for a small-town hotel on a weeknight, I thought. The lobby was deserted when I walked in, my footsteps echoing on the worn linoleum floor. A bell sat on the front desk, so I gave it a ring. After a moment, a thin man with graying hair emerged from a back room. He had a slightly vacant look in his eyes as he approached the desk. "Good evening, checking in?" he asked in a monotone voice. "Yes, reservation for Max Turner," I replied, stifling a yawn. It had been a long day of driving. The clerk's fingers clacked on an ancient-looking computer keyboard. His brow furrowed slightly as he stared at the screen. "I'm sorry, sir. I'm not seeing any reservation under that name. Are you sure you have the right hotel?" I felt a flicker of irritation. "Yes, I'm sure. I made the reservation myself last week. Could you check again?" He tapped away for another minute, then shook his head. "I'm afraid there's nothing here for Max Turner. We do have some vacancies, though, if you'd like to book a room for tonight." Frustrated but too tired to argue, I agreed to take an available room. As the clerk processed my credit card, I noticed his name tag read Tom. "Long night, Tom?" I asked, trying to make conversation. He looked at me blankly. "I'm sorry?" "Your name tag," I said, gesturing. "It says Tom." He glanced down in confusion. "Oh, yes, Tom, right." Something about his demeanor struck me as odd, but I was too exhausted to dwell on it. He handed me a key card for room 237, and I headed up to get some much-needed sleep. The hallway was dimly lit and eerily quiet. My footsteps on the thin carpet seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. When I reached room 237, I swiped the key card, but the lock flashed red. I tried again with the same result. Sighing in exasperation, I trudged back down to the lobby. Tom was still at the desk, staring vacantly into space. "Excuse me," I said, "but the key isn't working for room 237. He blinked at me in confusion. "I'm sorry, sir, but room 237 is occupied." "What? But you just gave me the key for that room 5 minutes ago." Tom shook his head slowly. "I don't recall checking anyone into that room tonight. It's been occupied by Mr. Klein for the past week." A chill ran down my spine. What was going on here? "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice level. There's clearly been some mix-up. Can you please just check your system again? I'm Max Turner. I just checked in a few minutes ago. Tom's face remained blank as he pecked at the keyboard. After a moment, he looked up at me. I'm sorry, sir, but I have no record of anyone by that name checking in tonight. Are you sure you're at the right hotel? My heart started to race. This couldn't be happening. Yes, I'm sure. You just checked me in. You gave me a key to room 237. Tom's expression didn't change. Sir, please calm down. As I said, room 237 is occupied by Mr. Robert Klein. He's been staying with us all week. I felt like I was losing my mind. How could he not remember checking me in just moments ago? And who the hell was Robert Klein? Can I speak to a manager, please? I asked, my voice shaking slightly. I'm afraid the manager isn't in at this hour, Tom replied flatly. Is there something I can help you with? I took a deep breath, trying to collect my thoughts. Okay, let's start over. My name is Max Turner. I made a reservation at this hotel last week. I just arrived and you checked me in about 10 minutes ago. But now you're saying you have no record of me, and the room you gave me is occupied by someone else. Does any of this make sense to you? Tom just stared at me blankly. I'm sorry, sir, but I have no recollection or record of checking in anyone by that name tonight. Are you feeling all right? Would you like me to call someone for you? I felt a wave of panic wash over me. What the hell was happening? Was I losing my mind? No, I need to sit down for a minute, I mumbled, stumbling over to a chair in the lobby. As I sat there trying to make sense of the situation, I heard the elevator ding. A middle-aged man in a bathrobe stepped out and approached the front desk. Excuse me, he said to Tom, but someone just tried to enter my room. Could you check to make sure the lock is working properly? My blood ran cold as I realized he must be talking about me. Of course, Mr. Klein, Tom replied. I'll send maintenance up right away to check on that. Mr. Klein. Robert Klein. The man supposedly staying in room 237, the room I had just been given a key for. I watched in stunned silence as Klein chatted casually with Tom for a few moments before heading back upstairs. Tom showed no sign of recognizing the contradictions in what was happening. My mind was reeling. I needed to get out of there to clear my head and figure out what was going on. I stood up on shaky legs and headed for the exit. Have a good night, sir, Tom called after me in the same monotone voice. As I burst out into the cool night air, I gulped in deep breaths, trying to calm myself. I must be overtired, I thought. I'm not thinking clearly. I just need to go for a short walk to clear my head, then I'll come back and sort this all out. I set off down the quiet street, the glow of streetlights creating pools of yellow in the darkness. As I walked, I tried to make sense of what had just happened. How could Tom have no memory of checking me in? And who was this Robert Klein character? After about 15 minutes, I turned back toward the hotel, feeling slightly calmer, but no less confused. As I approached the building, I noticed something odd. My car was gone from the parking lot. My heart started pounding again as I jogged over to where I was sure I had parked. There was no sign of my vehicle. I spun in a circle, scanning the lot, but it was nowhere to be seen. Panic rising in my chest, I rushed back into the lobby. Tom was still at the desk, that same vacant expression on his face. "My car!" I gasped. "My car is missing from the parking lot." Tom blinked at me slowly. "I'm sorry, sir, but I don't recall any cars being parked in our lot tonight, besides our current guests." I felt like I was going to be sick. "But I just drove up here less than an hour ago. You checked me in. Don't you remember?" He shook his head. "Sir, as I explained earlier, we have no record of you checking in tonight. Are you sure you're feeling all right? Would you like me to call someone for you?" I staggered backward, my mind spinning. This couldn't be happening. It didn't make any sense. I, I need to call the police, I stammered. Of course, sir. The phone is right over there, Tom said, gesturing to an ancient-looking payphone on the wall. With trembling fingers, I picked up the receiver and dialed 911. A female voice answered after 2 rings. 911, what's your emergency? I need to report a stolen vehicle, I said, my voice shaking. I'm at the Hillside Inn and my car has disappeared from the parking lot. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Sir, did you say you're at the Hillside Inn? Yes, that's right. Another pause. Sir, the Hillside Inn has been closed for renovations for the past month. There shouldn't be anyone there. I felt the blood drain from my face. What? No, that's impossible. I'm standing in the lobby right now. I can see the desk clerk right in front of me. Sir, I assure you the Hillside Inn is closed. Where are you really calling from? My whole body was shaking now. I'm telling you, I'm in the lobby of the Hillside Inn. I just checked in an hour ago. Okay, sir. Please try to remain calm. I'm going to dispatch an officer to check on you. Can you stay on the line with me? I nodded, forgetting she couldn't see me. Yes, I'll stay on the line. As I waited for the police to arrive, I kept my eyes fixed on Tom at the front desk. He seemed oblivious to my distress, staring blankly into space. After what felt like an eternity, I heard sirens approaching. A moment later, 2 officers burst through the front doors, guns drawn. "Police, don't move!" one of them shouted. I dropped the phone and raised my hands instinctively. "I'm the one who called. I'm not armed." The officers looked around in confusion, then slowly lowered their weapons. "Sir, who were you talking to just now?" one of them asked. I turned to gesture at Tom behind the desk, but my words died in my throat. The desk was empty. Tom was gone. I spun around, taking in my surroundings for the first time. The lobby was dark and dusty. Sheets covered the furniture. A sign on the desk read, "Closed for renovations." My legs gave out and I collapsed to the floor, my mind unable to process what was happening. The officers helped me to my feet and led me outside. As they questioned me, I babbled incoherently about checking in, the missing car, Tom the desk clerk, and Robert Klein in room 237. They searched the hotel but found no sign of anyone else inside. My car was discovered parked around back, right where I had left it. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened to me that night. The police report chalked it up to exhaustion and possible hallucinations from carbon monoxide exposure in my car. But I know what I experienced was real. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, Tom's blank face floating before my eyes. And in my darkest moments, I wonder, what if I'm not really Max Turner? What if my identity is slipping away, being replaced by someone else, just like it almost was that night? I don't have any answers. All I know is that I'll never set foot in another hotel again as long as I live, and I'll always be looking over my shoulder, wondering if the next Robert Klein is coming to take my place. I never thought I'd find myself in the middle of a crime scene, but that's exactly what happened during my stay at the Pinewood Motel last month. As a journalist, I'm used to chasing stories, not becoming one. But sometimes life has other plans. It was supposed to be a routine assignment, covering a small-town festival for a local interest piece. Nothing exciting, just your typical fluff story to fill space in the weekend edition. I arrived in town late Friday evening and checked into the only accommodation available, a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. The Pinewood Motel had definitely seen better days. The neon sign flickered weakly, half the letters burnt out. Paint peeled from the weathered exterior, and the parking lot was more potholes than pavement. But beggars can't be choosers, and I was exhausted after the long drive. I just wanted to crash for the night. The bored-looking clerk barely glanced up from his phone as he handed me the key to room 12. "Checkout's at 11, he mumbled. I nodded and headed down the dimly lit hallway, dragging my suitcase behind me. The room was about what I expected. Musty, dated decor straight out of the 70s, and a faint smell of cigarette smoke that no amount of air freshener could mask. But the bed seemed clean enough, and the TV worked, so I settled in for the night. I must have dozed off watching some late-night infomercials, because I was jolted awake around 2 a.m. by the sound of squealing tires in the parking lot. Groggy and disoriented, I stumbled to the window and peeked through a gap in the curtains. A black SUV with tinted windows had pulled up right outside my room. Two men in dark clothing got out, looking around furtively before opening the back of the vehicle. My journalistic instincts kicked in, and I watched intently, wondering what was going on. The men started unloading large duffel bags from the SUV, each one looking heavy. I counted at least 6 bags before they disappeared around the corner, presumably to another room. A few minutes later they returned, empty-handed, and drove off as quickly as they had arrived. My mind was racing. What was in those bags? Drugs, weapons, stolen goods? This certainly didn't seem like a legitimate delivery in the middle of the night. I debated calling the police, but realized I had no real evidence of wrongdoing. For all I knew, it could be innocent, maybe late-night guests with a lot of luggage, but something about the secretive way they had acted set off alarm bells. Unable to shake my suspicions, I decided to do a bit of investigating. I quietly opened my door and peered down the hallway. All was silent and still. I crept out of my room, wincing at every creak of the old floorboards beneath my feet. I made my way towards the corner where I had seen the men disappear with the bags. There was a door there marked "Staff Only." I tried the handle, but it was locked. Pressing my ear against the door, I strained to hear any sounds from within, but there was nothing. Just as I was about to give up and return to my room, I heard voices approaching from around the corner. Panicked, I looked for somewhere to hide. The only option was a rickety housekeeping cart parked nearby. I dove behind it just as 2 men rounded the corner, speaking in hushed tones. "We've got another shipment coming in tomorrow night," one man said gruffly. "Boss wants us to move fast. In and out in 15 minutes max." "What about the motel staff?" the other man asked. "Can we trust them to keep quiet?" "Don't worry about them," the first man replied. "They're well paid to look the other way. Just focus on getting the product moved quickly and discreetly." My heart was pounding so loudly, I was sure they would hear it. I held my breath as they passed by, praying they wouldn't notice me crouched behind the cart. To my immense relief, they continued on without a glance in my direction, disappearing into one of the rooms further down the hall. As soon as I heard the door click shut, I bolted back to my own room, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I tried to process what I had just witnessed. This was clearly some kind of ongoing criminal operation, using the motel as a distribution point for who knows what illegal goods. I knew I should call the police, but fear held me back. What if these guys had connections in local law enforcement? What if they found out I was the one who tipped off the cops? I was just a small-time journalist, way out of my depth in a situation like this. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, jumping at every little sound. When morning finally came, I checked out as quickly as possible, making up an excuse about a family emergency to the clerk. As I drove away from the Pinewood Motel, I kept checking my rear-view mirror, half expecting to see that black SUV following me. For weeks afterward, I debated what to do with the information I had stumbled upon. Part of me wanted to dive deeper, to break the story wide open, but the rational part of my brain reminded me how dangerous that could be. In the end, I anonymously passed along what I knew to a contact in the state police, hoping they would investigate further. To this day, I don't know what became of that tip. I've kept an eye on the local news, but there's been no mention of any busts or arrests at the Pinewood Motel. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if the stress and exhaustion of my job had caused me to blow an innocent late-night check-in out of proportion. But deep down, I know what I saw and heard that night was real. There are moments when I still feel that flash of fear, remembering how close I came to being discovered. It was a stark reminder that danger and crime can lurk in the most unassuming places, even a run-down motel in a sleepy small town. I've become much more cautious in my travels since then, always hyper-aware of my surroundings. That one night changed my perspective on so many things. As a journalist, I'm used to reporting on other people's stories, but sometimes the most impactful stories are the ones we live ourselves. The experience at the Pinewood Motel taught me that the line between observer and participant can blur in an instant. It's a lesson I'll never forget, and one that's made me both a better journalist and a more vigilant person. Because you never know when you might accidentally stumble into a story much bigger and more dangerous than you ever bargained for. As I sat down at a small table near the back, I couldn't help but overhear bits and pieces of a conversation from the booth behind me. At first, I tried to tune it out and focus on the menu, but certain words caught my attention. Security cameras, safe, getaway car. My heart started racing as I realized I was listening to what sounded like plans for a robbery. I glanced over my shoulder, trying to get a look at the men without being obvious. There were 3 of them, all dressed casually in jeans and dark jackets. They spoke in low voices, leaning in close over the table. One had a notepad out and seemed to be sketching something. "The night manager leaves at 11, one of them muttered. "That's our window." "What about the front desk clerk?" another asked. "Don't worry about her. I've got that covered," the third man replied with a chuckle that sent chills down my spine. I turned back to my menu, hand shaking slightly as I tried to process what I was hearing. Should I say something to the hotel staff, call the police, or just mind my own business? Part of me wanted to just finish my meal quickly and retreat to my room, pretending I hadn't heard anything, but I knew I couldn't just ignore this. When the waitress came to take my order, I asked in a whisper if there was a manager I could speak to privately. She gave me an odd look, but nodded and went to fetch someone. A few minutes later, a man in a suit approached my table. "Is everything all right, sir?" he asked. I explained in a low voice that I had overheard what sounded like plans for a robbery. The manager's eyes widened, and he asked me to come with him to his office. As we walked away, I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I glanced back at the booth and saw one of the men watching us leave, a suspicious look on his face. In the manager's office, I recounted everything I had heard. He thanked me and said he would contact the police immediately. I gave him my contact information in case they needed a statement. As I left his office, my hands were clammy with nervous sweat. I decided to skip dinner and head straight to my room. As I walked down the hallway to the elevator, I heard footsteps behind me. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding. Just as I reached the elevator and pressed the button, a hand grabbed my shoulder roughly. "Hey, buddy, where are you running off to in such a hurry?" a gruff voice said. I turned to see 2 of the men from the restaurant. Up close, I could see the cold, hard look in their eyes. The taller one kept his hand on my shoulder, gripping tightly. "Jay, just heading up to my room," I stammered. "Long day, you know." The shorter man stepped closer, invading my personal space. "Funny, we could have sworn we saw you chatting with the manager back there. What was that all about?" The elevator dinged and the doors slid open. I tried to step inside, but the man's grip on my shoulder tightened painfully. "I think you and us need to have a little chat," he growled. Before I could react, they shoved me into the elevator. The taller one pulled out a small handgun and pressed it against my side as the doors closed. "You're coming with us, and you're going to keep your mouth shut if you know what's good for you," he hissed in my ear. My mind raced in panic as they marched me out of the elevator on the top floor and down a deserted hallway. What were they going to do to me? Had they already hurt the manager? Where was the third man? They stopped in front of a room, and the shorter one unlocked it, shoving me inside. It was a standard hotel room, but messy. Clothes and papers strewn about, empty food containers on every surface. The third man from the restaurant was there, pacing anxiously. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded. "I thought I told you to lay low." "Change of plans," the man with the gun said. "This nosy bastard overheard us and went running to the manager. We couldn't risk him blabbing to the cops." The third man swore loudly and ran his hands through his hair. "This is bad. This is really bad. We got to get out of here now." "Not until we figure out what to do with him," the shorter one said, jerking his thumb at me. I stood there trembling, trying to look anywhere but at the gun still pointed at me. "Please," I said, my voice shaking. I won't say anything, I swear. Just let me go and I'll forget this ever happened." The man with the gun laughed harshly. "Yeah, right. You expect us to believe that?" "We can't just let him go," the third man said. "He's seen our faces. He knows too much." My blood ran cold at his words. They were going to kill me. I was going to die in this dirty hotel room, and no one would know what happened to me. Tears pricked at my eyes as I thought of my family, my friends, all the things I'd never get to do or say. Suddenly there was a loud banging on the door. "Police! Open up!" The three men froze, looking at each other in panic. In that moment of distraction, I acted on pure instinct. I lunged forward and grabbed for the gun, catching the man by surprise. We grappled for control, the weapon between us. I heard shouting, more banging on the door, and then a deafening bang as the gun went off. For a moment, everything seemed to move in slow motion. I felt a searing pain in my shoulder and stumbled backwards. The door burst open, and police officers swarmed in, shouting orders. The three men were tackled to the ground and handcuffed. Someone was asking if I was all right, pressing a cloth to my bleeding shoulder. The next few hours passed in a blur of sirens, hospital lights, and police questioning. It turned out the hotel manager had called the police as soon as I left his office, and they had arrived just in time. The would-be robbers were arrested, and I was hailed as a hero for helping to stop the crime. But even as I gave my statement and accepted the thanks of the hotel staff, I couldn't shake the cold fear that had gripped me. The sound of that gunshot kept replaying in my head. The feeling of the cold metal pressed against my side. The look in their eyes when they realized I had overheard them. It's been months since that night, but I still have nightmares about it. I jump at unexpected noises and find myself constantly looking over my shoulder in public places. I know I did the right thing by speaking up, but sometimes I wonder, what if I had just minded my own business? What if I had finished my dinner and gone to bed, none the wiser? But then I remember the waitress, the night manager, all the innocent people who could have been hurt if that robbery had gone through. and I know that despite the terror and trauma, I would make the same choice again. Sometimes doing the right thing means putting yourself in danger. I just never thought I'd have to learn that lesson in such a visceral, terrifying way. So if you're ever in a situation where you overhear something suspicious, don't ignore it, but maybe be a little more discreet than I was when reporting it. You never know who might be watching. I had a long day of meetings and presentations, so I was exhausted by the time I got back to my room around 11 p.m. I took a quick shower, got into my pajamas, and crashed into bed. I remember setting my phone alarm for 7 a.m. before drifting off to sleep. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up feeling groggy and disoriented. The room was pitch black, but something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it at first. Then I heard it, soft, rhythmic breathing coming from somewhere in the room. My heart started racing as I realized I wasn't alone. I lay there frozen, straining my ears and trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But the breathing continued. It was definitely real, and it was coming from the direction of the desk chair near the window. Panic gripped me as I tried to figure out what to do. Should I turn on the light, try to sneak out of the room, yell for help? I was terrified that any sudden movement would alert the intruder. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute or two, I slowly reached over to the nightstand and felt around for my phone. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I managed to grab it and pull it under the covers, shielding the light as I turned on the flashlight function. Taking a deep breath, I suddenly whipped the covers off and shone the light towards the chair. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was a man slumped in the chair, fast asleep. He was wearing jeans and a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up, partially obscuring his face. I let out an involuntary gasp, and the man stirred slightly but didn't wake up. He mumbled something incoherent and shifted position. The panic rising in my chest threatened to overwhelm me. How did he get in here? What was he planning to do? I knew I needed to get out of there immediately. As quietly as I could, I slipped out of bed and tiptoed towards the door, keeping my phone light trained on the sleeping intruder. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure it would wake him up. Just as I reached the door, my foot caught on my suitcase that I'd left on the floor. I stumbled, barely catching myself before I fell. The noise seemed deafening in the silence of the room. The man in the chair jolted awake with a start. Our eyes met, and for a split second we both just stared at each other in shock. Then he leapt to his feet, and I screamed, fumbling with the door handle in panic. I managed to wrench the door open and ran out into the hallway, still screaming at the top of my lungs. I sprinted towards the elevator, not daring to look back. I could hear footsteps behind me, but I didn't slow down. Just as I reached the elevator, a door opened and an older couple stepped out into the hall, looking concerned. "What's going on?" the man asked. I was gasping for breath and could barely get the words out. There's a man in my room," I stammered. "He broke in while I was sleeping." The woman put her arm around me protectively as her husband peered down the hallway. "I don't see anyone," he said. "Are you sure?" I nodded vigorously. "Yes, he was sleeping in the chair. Please, we need to call security." The couple ushered me into their room, and the husband called down to the front desk to report the incident. Within minutes, 2 security guards arrived along with the night manager. I was still shaking as I recounted what had happened. The security guards went to check my room while the manager tried to calm me down. He assured me they would get to the bottom of this and offered to move me to a new room immediately. When the guards returned, They confirmed that there was no one in my room now, but the window was open. They theorized that the intruder must have escaped that way when I ran out. I was moved to a new room on a different floor, but there was no way I was going back to sleep that night. I sat up until dawn, jumping at every little noise. When morning finally came, I checked out early and got the hell out of there. I thought that would be the end of it. A terrifying experience, but one I could try to put behind me. But a week later, I got a call from the local police department. They wanted me to come in and give a statement about what happened that night. When I arrived at the station, a detective sat me down and explained that they had made an arrest in connection with my case. It turned out that one of the night shift employees at the hotel had been selling copies of the master key card to criminals. They had arrested the employee as well as several individuals who had purchased the illegal key cards. One of them matched the description I gave of the man in my room. The detective told me that there had been a string of thefts from hotel rooms in the area over the past few months. Guests would wake up to find valuables missing, but there was never any sign of forced entry. Now they knew how the thieves were getting in. I was horrified to learn how close I had come to being robbed, or worse. The detective said I was lucky that the man fell asleep instead of going through with whatever he had planned. They asked me to look at some photos to see if I could identify the intruder. As soon as I saw his picture, my stomach dropped. It was definitely him. The detective told me they had found my hotel key card in his possession when they arrested him. I gave my official statement, and they said they would be in touch if they needed anything else for the case. As I left the police station, I felt a mix of relief that they had caught the guy, but also lingering fear and violation. It's been several months now, and I still have trouble sleeping in hotel rooms. I check and double-check the locks multiple times a night. I prop a chair under the door handle for extra security. I'm not sure I'll ever feel truly safe in a hotel again. The whole experience opened my eyes to how vulnerable we can be, even in places we assume are secure. I'm much more cautious now about my surroundings and personal safety when traveling. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't woken up that night. Would he have robbed me and slipped out undetected? Or did he have something worse planned? I try not to dwell on the what-ifs too much, but it's hard not to when something like that happens to you. I'm sharing my story as a warning to others. Always be aware of your surroundings, even in places that seem safe. Use all the security measures available in hotel rooms. And if something doesn't feel right, trust your instincts. I'm still processing what happened that night, but I'm grateful it didn't turn out worse. I know I was lucky, and I don't take that for granted. But the feeling of violation and fear is something that will stay with me for a long time to come. I was just about to crawl into bed after a long day at work when I noticed something strange outside my bedroom door. There on the floor was a small package wrapped in brown paper, about the size of a shoebox. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at it, frozen in place. I definitely hadn't ordered anything, and my roommates were all out of town for the weekend. Who could have left this here? With shaking hands, I picked up the package. It was surprisingly heavy for its size. There was no address label or any kind of marking on the outside. Just plain brown paper held together with packing tape. A chill ran down my spine as I carried it over to my desk and set it down. For several long minutes, I just stared at the mysterious package, debating whether I should open it. Part of me was terrified of what might be inside, but my curiosity was overwhelming. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a pair of scissors and carefully cut through the tape. As I pulled back the paper wrapping, my breath caught in my throat. Inside was a plain manila folder stuffed full of documents. With trembling fingers, I opened the folder and began scanning the contents. My eyes widened in shock as I realized what I was looking at. These were highly classified government documents, internal memos, redacted reports, surveillance photos, page after page of sensitive information that was clearly not meant for public eyes. How the hell did this end up at my doorstep? As I flipped through the papers, my mind was racing. Was this some kind of mistake? Or had someone deliberately left these for me to find? And if so, why? I had no connection to any government agencies or classified projects. I was just a regular office worker living a mundane life. This made no sense. Suddenly, a sound from the hallway made me jump. Footsteps. Someone was coming up the stairs. Panicked, I shoved all the papers back in the folder and looked around frantically for a place to hide it. In a split-second decision, I yanked open my closet door and buried the folder under a pile of clothes, just as I heard a key turning in the front door lock. My heart was pounding as I quickly closed the closet and dove into bed, pulling the covers up. I squeezed my eyes shut and tried to steady my breathing, pretending to be asleep. The apartment door creaked open and heavy footsteps entered. They paused in the living room for a moment, then started moving down the hall toward my bedroom. I lay there rigid with fear as the footsteps stopped right outside my door. There was a long, agonizing silence. Then I heard the sound of paper rustling, followed by a low curse. The mysterious visitor must have realized the package was gone. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated back down the hall. I heard more shuffling and rustling, like someone searching through the apartment. Finally, the front door opened and closed again. I waited several more minutes before I dared to move, listening intently for any sign that the person might return. When I was sure the coast was clear, I leapt out of bed and ran to the window. Peering out into the darkness, I caught a glimpse of a tall figure in a dark coat hurrying away down the street. They paused at the corner and looked back toward my building before disappearing around the block. My mind was reeling as I tried to process what had just happened. Who was that person? Were they looking for the classified documents? How did they get a key to my apartment? None of this made any sense. I paced back and forth, debating what to do. Should I call the police? But what would I even tell them? I had no proof of anything suspicious, and how would I explain the top-secret documents hidden in my closet? For all I knew, simply possessing those files could get me arrested. As I agonized over my options, a notification pinged on my phone. My blood ran cold as I read the text from an unknown number. "Where are the files? You have 1 hour to return them, or there will be consequences." My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone. This was really happening. Whoever had left those documents clearly wanted them back, and they knew how to find me. Panic overtook me as I realized I was in way over my head. I had to get rid of those files immediately, but how? I couldn't just throw them in the trash. They'd be easily found, and I had no idea who to trust or turn them over to safely. With trembling fingers, I grabbed the folder from my closet and shoved it into my backpack. I had to get out of the apartment. Maybe if I kept moving, I could figure out what to do. I threw on a jacket and shoes, then hesitated at the door. What if they were waiting for me outside? Taking a deep breath, I slowly turned the doorknob and peeked out into the hall. It was empty and silent. Moving as quietly as I could, I crept down the stairs and out the back entrance of my building. The cool night air hit me as I emerged into the alley behind the apartments. I looked around nervously, but didn't see anyone. Not knowing where else to go, I started walking briskly down the alley, constantly glancing over my shoulder. Every shadow and sound made me jump. I felt like I was being watched, even though the streets seemed deserted. After a few blocks, I ducked into a 24-hour diner, hoping to catch my breath and think. As I slid into a booth, my phone buzzed again. Another text from the unknown number. "We see you. Don't try to run. Bring the files to Jefferson Park in 30 minutes or else." My heart was racing as I stared at the message in disbelief. How did they know where I was? Were they tracking my phone somehow? I looked around the diner wildly, searching for anyone suspicious. There were only a couple other late-night patrons, engrossed in their meals. But I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. Abandoning my plan to stay put, I bolted out of the diner and started running down the sidewalk. I had no destination in mind. I just knew I had to keep moving. My backpack bounced heavily against my back with each step, a constant reminder of the dangerous cargo I was carrying. As I ran, my mind was spinning. Who were these people? How far would they go to get these documents back? I was just an ordinary person caught up in something way bigger than me. How the hell was I going to get out of this? I zigzagged through the streets, ducking down alleys and doubling back, trying to lose anyone who might be following me. But no matter where I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. After what felt like hours of aimless running, I found myself in a deserted industrial area on the outskirts of town. Panting heavily, I leaned against the wall of an abandoned warehouse to catch my breath. That's when I heard the sound of approaching footsteps. Panic seized me as I looked around frantically for somewhere to hide. The footsteps were getting closer. In desperation, I tried the handle of a rusty door on the warehouse. To my amazement, it opened. I slipped inside just as a beam of light swept across the area where I'd been standing moments before. Through a crack in the door, I saw two men in dark suits prowling around outside, speaking in hushed tones. They were clearly searching for something, or someone. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure they'd hear it. I backed away from the door, fumbling in the darkness. The warehouse was pitch black inside. I took a few careful steps, feeling my way along the wall. Suddenly, my foot caught on something, and I stumbled, crashing to the ground. The noise echoed loudly in the empty space. I froze, listening intently. Had they heard? After a moment of silence, I heard the warehouse door creak open. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness, sweeping back and forth. "We know you're in here," a deep voice called out. "Just give us the files and we'll let you go. No harm done." I didn't believe that for a second. Staying as quiet as possible, I crawled along the floor, desperate to find a hiding spot. My hand brushed against what felt like a large crate or box. I quickly squeezed behind it, making myself as small as possible. The flashlights drew closer, illuminating dusty machinery and piles of debris. I held my breath as the beams passed just inches from my hiding spot. Come out, wherever you are," another voice taunted. "You're only making this worse for yourself." I stayed perfectly still, not daring to move a muscle. Minutes ticked by as they searched the warehouse. I was sure they'd find me at any moment. But somehow, miraculously, their lights never fell on my hiding spot. After what felt like an eternity, I heard them moving toward the exit. Damn it, they must have slipped out somehow. Let's check the next building. The door slammed shut, plunging the warehouse back into darkness. I waited several more minutes to be sure they were really gone before I allowed myself to breathe again. My whole body was shaking as the adrenaline wore off. What the hell had I gotten myself into? These people were clearly professionals, and they weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. I knew I couldn't keep running forever. Sooner or later, they'd catch up to me. I had to find a way to get rid of these files and end this nightmare. With trembling hands, I pulled out my phone and did a search for the nearest police station. There was one about a mile away. Maybe if I could make it there, I'd be safe. I could turn over the documents and explain everything. Taking a deep breath, I crept out of my hiding spot and made my way to the warehouse door. I listened carefully for any sound of my pursuers, but all was quiet. Slowly, I eased the door open and peeked out. The street appeared deserted. Gathering my courage, I slipped out of the warehouse and started speed walking toward the police station. Every shadow made me flinch. Every passing car filled me with terror that it might screech to a halt and men in suits would leap out. But somehow, miraculously, I made it to the police station without incident. As I approached the front doors, an overwhelming sense of relief washed over me. I was going to be okay. This nightmare was finally going to end. Just as I reached for the door handle, a hand clamped down on my shoulder. I spun around in terror to find myself face to face with a stern-looking man in a dark suit and sunglasses. "I'll take those files now," he said coldly, holding out his hand. I opened my mouth to call for help, but no sound came out. The man's grip tightened painfully on my shoulder as he repeated, "The files, now." With shaking hands, I slowly reached into my backpack and pulled out the folder. As soon as the man took it, his demeanor changed completely. He gave me a friendly pat on the back and said cheerfully, "Thanks for your cooperation, citizen. Have a nice night." And just like that, he strolled away, disappearing into the darkness as suddenly as he had appeared. I stood there in shock, unable to process what had just happened. After a few minutes, I gathered my wits enough to go into the police station and try to report what had occurred. But of course, without the files or any evidence, they just dismissed me as some drunk or crazy person. I couldn't even fully explain what had been in those documents. To this day, I have no idea what was really in that folder or who those men were. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I'll catch a glimpse of a man in a dark suit on the street, and my heart will race. I've moved twice since that night, always looking over my shoulder. I've never felt truly safe again. Whatever secrets were in those files, I hope they were worth upending my entire life over. But I have a feeling I'll never know the truth. I was exhausted when I checked into the Oakwood Inn after a long day of driving. The quaint bed and breakfast looked charming from the outside, with its Victorian architecture and well-manicured garden. But all I cared about at that moment was getting to my room and collapsing into bed. The elderly woman at the front desk greeted me warmly as I entered the cozy lobby. "Welcome to Oakwood Inn, dear. I'm Mrs. Perkins, the owner. You must be our 8 o'clock check-in." She handed me an old-fashioned brass key. "You'll be in room 7, up the stairs and to the left. Let me know if you need anything at all." I mumbled my thanks and trudged up the creaky wooden staircase, dragging my suitcase behind me. The narrow hallway was dimly lit by wall sconces, casting flickering shadows. I found room 7 and fumbled with the key in the lock. The room was small but comfortable, with floral wallpaper and antique furniture. I barely took it in before dropping my bags and flopping face first onto the 4-poster bed. Within minutes, I was fast asleep. I woke early the next morning, feeling refreshed. Sunlight streamed through the lace curtains as I got up to unpack and get ready for the day. That's when I noticed something odd. My suitcase wasn't where I'd left it by the door. It was now sitting next to the dresser on the other side of the room. Puzzled, I tried to remember if I'd moved it before going to bed, but I was certain I hadn't unpacked at all. Maybe the cleaning staff had tidied up while I was asleep. It seemed strange, but I shrugged it off and went about my morning routine. After showering and dressing, I decided to explore the charming little town before my afternoon meeting. I made sure to tuck my laptop and other valuables safely in my suitcase before heading out. I spent a pleasant few hours wandering the quaint shops and cafes. When I returned to my room that afternoon to freshen up, everything seemed normal at first glance. But as I went to grab my laptop, I realized my suitcase had been moved again, this time from beside the dresser to the foot of the bed. A chill ran down my spine. I was absolutely certain I hadn't touched it since that morning. I quickly unzipped the bag to check my belongings. Everything appeared to be there, but some items were in different places than I remembered. My stomach churned with unease. I told myself I was being paranoid. The cleaning staff must have moved things while tidying up. But why would they need to go through my personal belongings? And why not just leave the suitcase where it was? That night, I had trouble falling asleep. Every creak of the old house made me jump. I kept imagining someone creeping around my room in the dark. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off. The next morning, my suitcase was in yet another spot, this time partially hidden behind the armchair in the corner. Now I knew something was definitely wrong. I hadn't touched it at all the day before. Heart pounding, I checked through my belongings again. This time, I was sure some things were missing. A necklace, some cash from my wallet, even a few pairs of socks. What the hell was going on? I marched downstairs, intending to confront Mrs. Perkins about the strange occurrences. But she was nowhere to be found. A sullen-looking teenage girl was manning the front desk instead. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I've noticed some concerning things happening in my room. Items being moved around, possibly some things missing. Is there someone I can speak to about this?" The girl barely glanced up from her phone. "Mrs. Perkins isn't here. You can leave a message if you want." Frustrated, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I returned to my room and set up my laptop to record video while I was out. I positioned it discreetly on the dresser, angled to capture most of the room. Then I deliberately placed some cash and jewelry in plain sight before heading out for the day. My skin crawled as I went about my business in town, imagining someone rifling through my belongings. I rushed back to the inn as soon as I could, heart racing as I entered my room. Sure enough, things had been moved again. The jewelry was gone, along with the cash. Hands shaking, I retrieved my laptop and pulled up the video recording. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then suddenly, a figure entered the frame. It was a man in his 40s wearing a hotel uniform. He moved purposefully around the room, opening drawers and searching through my bags. I watched in horror as he pocketed the items I'd left out, along with several other things. Rage and fear battled inside me. I wanted to confront this thief immediately, but I was also terrified of what he might do if cornered. I decided to take the evidence to the police instead. I quickly packed up my belongings, not wanting to spend another minute in that room. As I hurried down the stairs, I nearly collided with Mrs. Perkins in the lobby. "Oh, my dear, you gave me a fright," she exclaimed. "Is everything all right? You look upset." I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "Mrs. Perkins, I've experienced some very disturbing things during my stay. Items in my room have been moved and some things stolen. I have video evidence of one of your employees going through my belongings." Her face paled. "Oh no, oh dear. I'm so terribly sorry. Please come with me to my office. We need to contact the authorities right away." She ushered me into a small room off the lobby and immediately called the police. As we waited for them to arrive, she wrung her hands anxiously. "I just can't believe this," she kept saying. "We're a respectable establishment. Nothing like this has ever happened before." When the police arrived, I showed them the video and gave my statement. They seemed to take it very seriously, especially when Mrs. Perkins identified the man in the video as Jake, one of their maintenance workers. "We've had some complaints about missing items from other guests recently," one officer told me. "But this is the first solid evidence. You may have helped us crack a string of thefts." They asked me to stick around town for a few days in case they needed any further information. Mrs. Perkins insisted on comping my stay and moving me to their best suite. She was mortified by what had happened and couldn't stop apologizing. Jake was arrested later that day when he showed up for his shift. They found many of the stolen items in his possession, including my missing jewelry. It turned out he had a history of similar thefts at other hotels and had been using a master key to access guests' rooms. I was relieved the culprit had been caught, but I still felt violated and on edge. Every noise made me jump, and I had trouble sleeping for weeks afterward. I kept replaying those videos in my mind, imagining what might have happened if I'd walked in while he was going through my things. It's been months now, and I still get chills thinking about those nights at Oakwood Inn. I'm much more cautious when I travel now, always using the safe and being hyper-aware of my surroundings. But I don't think I'll ever be able to shake that feeling of vulnerability, knowing that someone invaded my private space so easily. I often wonder how long Jake had been operating undetected. How many other guests had their belongings rifled through or stolen? It's a chilling reminder that you can never be too careful, even in places that seem safe and welcoming. The experience has definitely changed the way I view hotel stays forever. I pulled into the nearly empty parking lot and made my way to the office. A bored-looking middle-aged man barely glanced up from his phone as I entered. "Need a room?" he grunted. I nodded, too tired for pleasantries. He slid me a key attached to a plastic tag with the number 13. Great, I thought. Just my luck. The room was about what I expected. Dingy floral wallpaper peeling at the corners, a sagging mattress, and the faint smell of stale cigarette smoke that no amount of air freshener could fully mask. But it was a place to lay my head, so I didn't complain. I tossed my duffel bag on the dresser and flopped onto the bed, not even bothering to change out of my clothes. I must have dozed off quickly because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a loud thump from the room next door. Disoriented, I fumbled for my phone to check the time, 2:37 a.m. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I heard another thump, followed by what sounded like something heavy being dragged across the floor. My heart began to race. What the hell was going on over there? I sat up in bed, straining my ears. The dragging sound continued, punctuated by occasional grunts of exertion. Then I heard a door open and close, followed by footsteps outside my window. Curiosity got the better of me. I crept to the window and carefully peered out through a gap in the dusty curtains. In the dim light from the parking lot, I saw a large man struggling to lift what looked like a heavy black garbage bag into the trunk of a beat-up sedan. As he heaved it in, I caught a glimpse of something pale poking out from a tear in the plastic. Was that An arm. I stumbled back from the window, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. I must still be dreaming, right? But as I heard the car door slam and the engine roar to life, I knew this was all too real. Panic set in. Should I call the police? But what would I even tell them? I had no proof of anything, just some strange noises and a suspicious bag. For all I knew, it could just be a guy taking out his trash in the middle of the night. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I paced the small room, debating what to do. By the time I worked up the courage to peek out the window again, the car was gone. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, jumping at every little sound. As soon as the first light of dawn broke, I threw my things in my bag and practically ran to my car. At the office, I tried to act casual as I returned the key, but I could feel my hands shaking. The same man from the night before was there, looking just as disinterested as before. As I turned to leave, something made me pause. Did you happen to see anyone leave really early this morning? Like in the middle of the night? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The man's eyes narrowed slightly. Nope, he said flatly. Didn't see nothing. But there was something in his tone, a hint of warning perhaps, that sent chills down my spine. I mumbled a hasty thanks and bolted for my car. As I peeled out of the parking lot, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just narrowly escaped something terrible. I drove for hours without stopping, constantly checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see that beat-up sedan following me. It's been weeks since that night, but I still can't get it out of my head. Every time I close my eyes, I see that pale arm sticking out of the garbage bag. I've scoured local news sites, looking for any reports of missing persons or discovered bodies, but so far, nothing. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if the stress of my long drive had caused me to hallucinate. But then I remember the cold look in the motel clerk's eyes when I asked about that night, and I know it was real. I don't know what exactly I witnessed that night at the Pine Grove Motel, but I'm certain it was something sinister. Was it a murderer disposing of a body, a kidnapping in progress, or something even worse that I can't even imagine? The not knowing haunts me. I've thought about reporting it to the police, but what would I say? I have no evidence, no names, not even a license plate number. Just the memory of those horrifying sounds and that glimpse of pale flesh in a garbage bag. I've always considered myself a rational person, not prone to flights of fancy or paranoia. But that night changed something in me. Now I find myself constantly looking over my shoulder, scanning every parking lot for that familiar sedan. I haven't been able to stay in another motel since. The thought of those thin walls and the secrets they might conceal is too much to bear. Sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wonder if I should have done more that night. Should I have tried to intervene somehow? Called the police despite my lack of concrete evidence? But then I remember the size of that man, the ease with which he lifted that heavy bag, and I know that any attempt to stop him would likely have ended with me being the next victim. The experience has left me questioning everything. How many horrors occur every day just out of sight? How many monsters walk among us, hiding behind mundane facades? That run-down motel, which I'd initially dismissed as merely shabby, now seems sinister in my memory. Was it just a convenient location for a random act of violence, or was there something more going on? The clerk's reaction to my question suggests he knew more than he let on. Is it possible the motel itself was somehow involved? These questions gnaw at me, keeping me awake at night. I find myself obsessively researching unsolved disappearances in the area, wondering if any of them might be connected to what I saw. But so far, I've found nothing conclusive. It's as if that night exists in a bubble, disconnected from the rest of reality. I know I need to move on, to put this experience behind me. But how do you forget something like that? How do you go back to normal life after catching a glimpse of the darkness that lurks just beneath the surface of our everyday world? I don't have any answers. All I know is that I'll never look at a roadside motel the same way again. And if I ever find myself driving late at night, no matter how tired I am, I'll keep going until I reach home. Because some things are worse than exhaustion, and some secrets are better left undiscovered. As I write this, part of me hopes that someone out there will recognize this story, that maybe they've had a similar experience or know something about what might have happened that night. But another part of me dreads the possibility of ever learning the full truth. Perhaps it's better not to know, to let this remain a mysterious, if terrifying, anomaly in an otherwise ordinary life. But regardless of whether I ever get answers, I know one thing for certain. I'll never forget that night at the Pine Grove Motel. The sounds of something heavy being dragged across the floor, the sight of that garbage bag with its horrifying contents, the cold look in the clerk's eyes. These things are seared into my memory forever. And though I've tried to convince myself it was all a misunderstanding, deep down I know that I witnessed something truly evil that night. So if you're reading this and you find yourself on a long, lonely stretch of highway as night falls, do yourself a favor. Keep driving. No matter how tired you are, no matter how inviting that motel bed might seem, just keep going. Because you never know what horrors might be unfolding behind those thin walls and faded curtains. And some things, once seen, can never be unseen. I trudged up to the 4th floor, eager to collapse into bed. But when I got to my room and swiped the key card, nothing happened. The little light on the door lock flashed red instead of green. I tried a few more times, swiping faster, slower, holding it there longer, but no luck. Frustrated, I headed back down to the front desk. The night clerk seemed annoyed when I explained the problem. He reprogrammed my key without a word and handed it back. This time, when I got to my room, the door opened smoothly. I breathed a sigh of relief as I wheeled my suitcase inside and flopped onto the bed. I must have dozed off for a bit, because the next thing I knew, I jolted awake to the sound of my phone vibrating. It was a text from an unknown number. Having any trouble with your room key? I felt a chill run down my spine. How did someone know about that? Was it the hotel somehow? I decided to ignore it and try to get some sleep, but as I was drifting off again, I heard a faint beeping sound coming from the door. My eyes shot open and I sat up, heart racing. The electronic lock was making rapid beeping noises, as if someone was trying to swipe a key card over and over. I held my breath, straining to listen. After about 30 seconds, it stopped. Now wide awake and on edge, I crept to the door and looked through the peephole. The hallway appeared empty. I carefully opened the door and peeked out. Nothing. Unsettled, I quickly shut and latched the door. Sleep wasn't coming easily after that. I must have eventually dozed off because I woke with a start around 3 a.m. The room was pitch black and dead silent. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I had the distinct feeling I wasn't alone. Call it a sixth sense, but the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I lay perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. That's when I heard it, the faintest rustle of movement coming from the corner of the room. My blood ran cold. Someone was in here with me. Fight or flight instinct kicking in, I lunged for the bedside lamp and flicked it on. The sudden light revealed a man crouched in the corner by the window. He was dressed in the hotel uniform, but I recognized him as the night clerk from the front desk. Our eyes locked for a split second before he bolted for the door. Adrenaline pumping, I leapt out of bed and chased after him. He fumbled with the door lock, giving me just enough time to grab his arm. We grappled for a moment before he shoved me backwards. I stumbled and fell, hitting my head on the corner of the dresser. Dazed, I looked up to see him sprinting down the hallway. I staggered to my feet and ran after him, yelling for help. But the hallways were deserted at this hour. He disappeared around a corner, and I lost sight of him. Breathing heavily, I stopped to get my bearings. That's when I noticed a service door slightly ajar at the end of the hall. Had he gone in there? Against my better judgment, I approached the door and peered inside. It led to a dimly lit stairwell. I hesitated for a moment, then made the split-second decision to follow. I had to know what was going on. Heart pounding, I crept down the stairs as quietly as I could. I could hear footsteps echoing from somewhere below. The stairwell seemed to go on forever, spiraling down into the bowels of the hotel. The further down I went, the mustier and damper it got. Eventually, I reached a heavy metal door labeled Maintenance Authorized Personnel Only. I put my ear to the door and heard muffled voices on the other side. Taking a deep breath, I turned the handle as slowly and quietly as possible. It wasn't locked. I eased the door open just a crack and peeked through. What I saw made my blood run cold. The room beyond was some kind of control center, with banks of monitors showing security camera feeds from all over the hotel. And there was the night clerk, talking urgently with two other men in hotel uniforms. I strained to hear what they were saying. Phrases like compromised and abort the operation jumped out at me. Were they talking about me? What operation? Suddenly, one of the men glanced toward the door. I ducked back, praying he hadn't seen me. But a moment later, I heard footsteps approaching. Panicked, I turned to flee back up the stairs. I only made it up one flight before the maintenance door burst open below. "Hey, stop right there!" a voice yelled. I ran faster, taking the stairs two at a time. I could hear multiple sets of footsteps pounding up after me. My lungs were burning as I finally reached the fourth-floor door. I burst out into the hallway and sprinted toward my room, fumbling for my key card. But when I got there and tried to swipe it, the lock flashed red. It wasn't working again. I glanced back to see my pursuers emerge from the stairwell. Desperate, I ran to the elevator and frantically pushed the call button. Come on, come on. The footsteps were getting closer. Just as they rounded the corner, the elevator dinged and the doors slid open. I dove inside and mashed the close door button. The last thing I saw as the doors closed was the night clerk's face, contorted with rage. The elevator started to ascend, and I sagged against the wall, gasping for breath. What the hell was going on in this hotel? When the doors opened again, I found myself in the deserted lobby. I bolted for the front entrance, not even bothering to grab my luggage from the room. I just needed to get out of there. But as I pushed through the revolving door, I collided hard with someone coming in. We both stumbled backwards. I looked up to apologize and felt the blood drain from my face. It was the night clerk. How had he gotten down here so fast? He grabbed my arm in an iron grip. "Sir, is everything all right?" "You seem distressed," he said loudly, for the benefit of the few people milling about the lobby. But his eyes were cold and threatening. I wrenched my arm free and backed away. "Stay away from me," I said, my voice shaking. "I'm calling the police." He held up his hands in a placating gesture. "Now, sir, there's no need for that. Why don't we go have a chat in my office and sort this out?" "No way in hell," I spat, continuing to back toward the exit. His expression darkened. "I really think you should reconsider," he said in a low voice, "for your own safety." At that moment, a taxi pulled up outside the hotel entrance. Without taking my eyes off the night clerk, I edged toward the door. "I'm leaving now," I said. "Don't try to stop me." He made no move to pursue as I backed out of the hotel and practically dove into the taxi. "Drive," I told the confused cabbie. "Just go now." As we pulled away from the curb, I looked back to see the night clerk watching from the doorway. A chill ran through me as we locked eyes one final time before the taxi turned a corner. I spent the rest of the night in a 24-hour diner, jumping at every sound. When the sun finally came up, I went to the police station to file a report. But without any real evidence beyond my wild story, there wasn't much they could do. I never did go back to retrieve my luggage. I just bought new clothes and got on the first flight home. To this day, I have no idea what was really going on at that hotel. Some kind of organized crime operation? A human trafficking ring? I'll probably never know for sure. All I know is that I'll never stay at the Oakwood Hotel again. And these days, I always check my room thoroughly and prop a chair under the doorknob before going to sleep in any hotel. You can never be too careful. Suddenly, a dark van screeched to a halt next to her. Before I could even process what was happening, two men in black hoodies leapt out and grabbed the woman. She screamed and fought back, but they overpowered her quickly. My heart started racing as I realized I was witnessing an abduction in progress. I froze for a split second, paralyzed by shock and fear. But then adrenaline kicked in, and I started sprinting towards them, yelling at the top of my lungs, "Hey, stop! Let her go!" My voice was nearly drowned out by a loud crack of thunder. The men looked up and saw me running towards them. They roughly shoved the woman into the back of the van and jumped in after her. I was still about 20 yards away when the van's tires squealed as it peeled away from the curb. I chased after it as fast as I could, but it was hopeless. The van turned a corner and disappeared into the rainy night. I stopped, gasping for breath, my mind reeling. Had that really just happened? It felt like a scene from a movie, not something you'd witness on a normal weeknight. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone to call 911. I paced back and forth on the sidewalk as I frantically explained to the dispatcher what I'd seen. They told me to stay put and that officers would be there soon. While I waited, a million thoughts raced through my head. Who was that woman? Why was she targeted? Should I have tried to intervene sooner? What if I'd left work just a few minutes earlier and been closer when it happened? The guilt and shock made me feel sick to my stomach. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only about 10 minutes, 2 police cruisers pulled up with their lights flashing. I gave my statement to the officers, describing every detail I could remember about the van, the men, and the woman. They seemed to take it very seriously and radioed the information to other units to be on the lookout. One of the officers asked if I'd be willing to come down to the station to work with a sketch artist. I agreed immediately, wanting to do anything I could to help. The reality of the situation was starting to sink in, and I felt overwhelmed. This wasn't just some random street crime. A woman had been violently abducted right in front of me. At the police station, I spent over an hour with the sketch artist, trying my best to recall every detail of the kidnappers' faces. It was frustrating because it had all happened so fast, and I hadn't gotten a great look at them. But slowly, the composite sketches started to take shape. After finishing with the sketches, a detective interviewed me again to go over my statement. He explained that they were treating this as a possible human trafficking case. Apparently, there had been a string of similar abductions in the area over the past few months. My stomach dropped as I realized the full horrifying implications. It was nearly 2 a.m. by the time I finally left the police station. I was utterly exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but there was no way I'd be able to sleep. I kept replaying the scene in my head, hearing the woman's terrified screams. The next day, I saw the story on the local news. They showed the composite sketches I'd helped create and asked the public to come forward with any information. I scoured the internet for updates, desperate to find out if they'd made any progress in the case. Days went by with no news. I couldn't focus at work. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the woman being shoved into that van. I started having nightmares where I was the one being abducted. The police called a couple times to ask follow-up questions, but it didn't seem like they had any solid leads. About a week after the incident, I got a call from the detective. They had identified the woman based on missing persons reports. Her name was Jessica, and she was 26 years old. She disappeared while walking home from her job as a nurse. Hearing those details made it even more real and heartbreaking. This wasn't just some nameless victim. She was a real person with a life and family who were frantically searching for her. The detective asked if I'd be willing to look at some photos to see if I recognized any of the men. I steeled myself and agreed. Flipping through mugshots of known human traffickers and violent offenders was disturbing to say the least, but I forced myself to study each face carefully, hoping something would trigger my memory. Unfortunately, none of them looked familiar. Weeks passed, and the case seemed to go cold. I tried to get back to my normal routine, but I couldn't shake the lingering fear and guilt. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder and avoiding going out at night. Every time I saw a dark van, my heart would start racing. Then, almost 2 months after the abduction, there was a break in the case. The police raided a house on the outskirts of town based on an anonymous tip. They rescued several women who were being held there, including Jessica. I burst into tears when I heard the news. The relief was overwhelming. The detectives asked me to come in again to see if I could identify any of the men they'd arrested in the raid. This time, as soon as they showed me the photos, I knew. The faces that had been haunting my nightmares were right there in front of me. My hands shook as I pointed them out. In the following weeks, more details emerged about the trafficking ring that had been operating in our area. It was larger and more organized than anyone had realized. Jessica and the other women who were rescued shared horrifying accounts of what they'd endured. I couldn't even imagine the trauma they'd been through. I ended up testifying at the trial of the men involved in Jessica's abduction. It was nerve-wracking to be in the same room as them, but I knew I had to do it. Jessica was there too, and seeing her alive and safe made it all worth it. She hugged me afterwards and thanked me for trying to help that night and for helping the police track them down. I broke down crying, feeling a complicated mix of emotions: relief, lingering guilt, and profound gratitude that she had survived. The whole experience changed me in ways I'm still processing. I'm much more cautious and aware of my surroundings now. But I also feel a stronger sense of civic duty. I've started volunteering with organizations that support trafficking survivors, and any time I see something suspicious, I don't hesitate to speak up or call for help. That rainy night is seared into my memory forever. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, reliving those terrifying moments. But I try to focus on the positive outcome, that Jessica and others were ultimately rescued and reunited with their families. It's a stark reminder that unimaginable things can happen even in ordinary places, but also that speaking up and taking action can make a real difference. I don't think I'll ever be able to walk down a dark street again without remembering what I witnessed, but I'm determined not to let fear control my life. Instead, I channel those feelings into being more aware, compassionate, and willing to help others. If sharing my story makes even one person more vigilant or encourages someone to report suspicious activity, then some good will have come from that harrowing night. I was on a solo backpacking trip through Europe, staying at cheap hostels to save money. After a long day of sightseeing in Prague, I checked into a rundown hostel on the outskirts of the city. The building was old and dimly lit, with creaky floorboards and peeling wallpaper. But the price was right, so I didn't think much of it. As I walked down the narrow hallway to my room, I noticed a faint, unpleasant odor. At first, I thought it was just typical hostel mustiness, but as I got closer to my room, the smell became more pronounced. It was a sickly, sweet scent that made my stomach churn. I unlocked the door to my tiny room and quickly shut it behind me, hoping to block out the smell. But even inside, I could still detect that nauseating odor seeping in. I opened the window, but it didn't help much. Exhausted from a day of walking, I decided to try and ignore it and get some sleep. But as I lay in bed, the smell seemed to grow stronger. It was a hot summer night, and the stuffy room only amplified the stench. I tossed and turned, unable to fall asleep. Around 2 a.m., I heard shuffling noises coming from the room next door, muffled thumps and scraping sounds like furniture being moved. Then I heard a door open and footsteps hurrying down the hall. My curiosity got the better of me. I poked my head out into the hallway but saw no one. The smell hit me like a wave. It was definitely coming from the neighboring room. My heart started racing. What if someone was hurt or sick in there? I hesitated, then softly knocked on their door. No answer. I tried the handle and to my surprise, it was unlocked. I know I shouldn't have, but I slowly pushed the door open, calling out, "Hello? Is everything okay in here?" The stench that hit me was overwhelming. I gagged and covered my nose with my shirt. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I made out a shape on the floor, a large suitcase or trunk. Holding my breath, I crept closer. That's when I saw the flies, a cloud of them buzzing around the trunk, and a dark stain spreading out from underneath it. My blood ran cold as the realization hit me. With shaking hands, I reached for the latches on the trunk. Part of me screamed to run away, to not look inside. But I had to know. I cracked the lid open just an inch. The smell that erupted was indescribable, and in that small gap, I caught a glimpse of rotting flesh and maggots. I slammed the trunk shut and stumbled backwards, retching. Oh God! Oh God! There was a body in there, a decomposing human body. Panic overtook me. I ran out of the room and down the stairs, not even bothering to grab my belongings. I burst out of the hostel onto the dark street, gasping for fresh air. My mind was reeling. Should I call the police? But I was in a foreign country. What if they thought I was involved somehow? And whoever put that body there could still be nearby. I started walking quickly, then running. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get far away from that place. The streets were empty at that hour. My footsteps echoed off the buildings as I ran. After about 20 minutes of aimless running, I found myself in a more populated area with some bars still open. I ducked into one, ordered a beer with shaking hands, and tried to calm down enough to think clearly. I pulled out my phone, thinking maybe I should at least send an anonymous tip to the local police. But as I started to type, a hand clamped down on my shoulder. I nearly jumped out of my skin. I spun around to see a large man looming over me. He spoke in accented English. "I think you and I need to have a little talk." My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. How had they found me so quickly? I stammered, I don't know anything. I didn't see anything." The man's grip tightened painfully on my shoulder. "Oh, but I think you did. Come with me, now." I was terrified, but I saw no way out. The bar was nearly empty, and no one was paying attention to us. With trembling legs, I stood and let the man lead me outside. A black car was waiting. The man shoved me into the back seat and got in beside me. Another man was in the driver's seat. As we pulled away, I felt the cold metal of a gun barrel press against my ribs. "Where are you taking me?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Somewhere we can have a private conversation," the man replied ominously. We drove for what felt like hours, leaving the city behind. I lost all sense of direction as we wound through dark country roads. Finally, we pulled up to an isolated farmhouse. They marched me inside and down to a cellar. My legs were weak with fear. This was it, I thought. They were going to kill me and bury my body where no one would ever find it. But to my surprise, when we entered the cellar, there were several other people there. They looked as scared and confused as I felt. One of the men who had brought me spoke. "All right, everyone. I know you're frightened, but we need your help. What you stumbled upon at the hostel was part of a much bigger operation. Human trafficking, organ harvesting, things you can't even imagine. We're an underground group working to expose it, but we need witnesses." I was stunned. This was not at all what I had expected. Over the next few hours, they explained everything. The horrors they were fighting against, the corruption that allowed it to continue, and the risks we would be taking if we agreed to help. It was almost dawn by the time they finished. My head was spinning with all the information. Part of me still wasn't sure if I could trust them, but I knew I couldn't just walk away and pretend I hadn't seen what I'd seen. In the end, I agreed to help. The next few months were a blur of clandestine meetings, covert evidence gathering, and constant fear of being discovered. There were times I wanted to give up, to run away and never look back. But I kept thinking of that body in the trunk, of all the other victims who had no one to speak for them. I had to see it through. Finally, we had enough evidence to take to the authorities. There was a massive sting operation. Dozens of arrests were made, including high-level officials. The full scope of the trafficking ring was exposed. It's been years now, but I still have nightmares about that night at the hostel. The smell, the flies. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I'm back in that room. I don't travel much anymore. I prefer to stay close to home where I feel safe. But I don't regret getting involved. I know we made a difference. I just wish I could forget the horrifying way it all began. I still had a few hours to kill before my business meeting, so I decided to relax in my hotel room for a bit. I'd just settled in on the bed and turned on the TV when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "I know what you did last night. I have photos. Send $500 to this account or I'll expose you." My heart started racing. What was this about? I hadn't done anything wrong. I'd flown in late last night, grabbed a quick dinner at the hotel bar, and gone straight to bed. There was nothing to expose. I tried to brush it off as a scam, but another text came through. "Don't ignore me. I'm watching you right now." A chill ran down my spine. I glanced around the room nervously. Was there a hidden camera somewhere? The thought made me feel violated and exposed. "This is ridiculous," I muttered, trying to calm myself down. "It's just some random scammer." But then my phone buzzed again. "Nice blue tie. Looks good with that white shirt." I froze. That's exactly what I was wearing. How could they know that? Panicked, I jumped up and started searching the room for cameras. I checked behind picture frames, in air vents, even in the smoke detector. But I couldn't find anything suspicious. My hands were shaking as I texted back, "Who are you? What do you want?" The reply was instant. "You know what I want. $500, or everyone sees the photos." "What photos?" I demanded. "I haven't done anything." "You sure about that? Check your email." Heart pounding, I opened my inbox. There was a new message from an unfamiliar address. I hesitated before clicking it, terrified of what I might see. It was a blurry image, clearly taken from a distance. I could make out what looked like me sitting at the hotel bar last night. But the angle was strange, like it had been taken from above somehow. Another text. "That's just a preview. I have much more incriminating shots. Pay up or they all go public." My mind was reeling. How was this possible? I racked my brain trying to think if I'd done anything even remotely scandalous, but came up empty. I'm a boring businessman on a work trip. The most exciting thing I did was have an overpriced burger and beer at the bar. Unless, had someone drugged me? Did something happen that I couldn't remember? The thought made me feel sick. "I don't understand," I texted back. "I seriously didn't do anything wrong. Please just leave me alone." Wrong answer. You have 1 hour to pay or I start sending these to your work contacts. Ice flooded my veins. Even if the photos weren't actually incriminating, just the implication could ruin my career. I couldn't risk it. With trembling fingers, I pulled up my banking app. I hesitated for a long moment before reluctantly initiating the transfer to the account number they'd sent. There, I sent the money. "Now leave me alone," I texted. "Smart choice. Pleasure doing business with you." I collapsed back onto the bed, feeling drained and violated. What the hell just happened? Part of me wanted to call the police, but what would I even tell them? I had no proof of anything. For all I knew, this person really did have compromising photos of me somehow. I must have dozed off at some point, because I was jolted awake by loud knocking at my door. Disoriented, I stumbled over to answer it. A hotel security guard was standing there looking concerned. "Sir, we've had reports of a disturbance in this room. Is everything all right?" I blinked at him in confusion. Yeah, everything's fine. Why?" He frowned. "We received complaints about yelling and things being thrown around. Mind if I take a look?" Still groggy, I stepped back to let him in. He did a quick sweep of the room, which was completely undisturbed. Must have been a mistake," he said. "Sorry to bother you, sir." As he turned to leave, something caught my eye. There was a small security camera in the hallway, pointed right at my door. A light bulb went off in my head. "Wait," I said. "That camera, does it record audio too?" The guard nodded. "Yeah, for guest safety. Why do you ask?" My mind was racing. I think I may have been the victim of a scam. Is there any way to check the hallway footage from last night? He looked at me quizzically but agreed to look into it. 20 minutes later, he was back with a laptop. "I've got the footage queued up, sir. What exactly are we looking for?" I explained about the threatening texts and how the scammer seemed to know details about me. We started reviewing the overnight footage. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But then, around 2 a.m., we spotted a figure in a hotel uniform lurking near my door. He appeared to be looking at a phone and typing. The guard's eyes widened. "That's Jake. He works the night shift at the front desk. We kept watching. Jake stayed there for nearly an hour, occasionally glancing up at the camera above my door. He must have been watching the camera feed on his phone, the guard said. That's how he knew what you were wearing. It all started falling into place. Jake had access to my reservation details, so he knew my contact info and work details. He used the hallway camera to spy on me and make it seem like he had hidden cameras in my room. I felt a complex mix of emotions, relief that there weren't actually any compromising photos, but also anger at being manipulated and extorted. The guard assured me they would handle Jake internally and refund the money I'd sent. He apologized profusely for the incident. I appreciate that they took care of it, but I'm still shaken. The violation of privacy, the fear and stress, it's not something I'll forget anytime soon. I'm writing this as a warning to others. Always be cautious, even in places where you expect to feel safe. You never know who might be watching or what their motives are. I'm heading home tomorrow, and I can't wait to get out of this hotel. I don't think I'll ever feel quite as secure in a hotel room again. The idea that someone could so easily spy on me and use that information against me is terrifying. It's a harsh reminder of how vulnerable we can be in this digital age. For now, I'm double-checking that my laptop camera is covered and my phone is off. I know it's probably an overreaction, but I can't shake the feeling of being watched. I just want to get through this night and go home where I know I'm safe. If there's one silver lining, it's that I've learned to trust my instincts. Deep down, I knew something wasn't right about those texts. In the future, I'll be quicker to question things that don't add up, rather than letting fear cloud my judgment. To anyone reading this, stay vigilant, trust your gut, and remember that not everything is as it seems. Sometimes the real danger isn't some shadowy blackmailer, but the seemingly harmless people we encounter every day. I've been traveling for work a lot lately, staying in different hotels almost every week. It can get lonely and monotonous, but I've gotten used to the routine. Check in, unpack, work, sleep, repeat. That all changed during my stay at the Pinewood Inn last month. I arrived late on a Tuesday night after a long drive. The hotel was pretty standard, an older building that had seen better days, but clean enough. As I pulled into the parking lot, I noticed a white van parked near the entrance. Something about it caught my eye, but I was too tired to give it much thought. The night clerk barely looked up from his phone as he handed me my key card. I trudged up to my second-floor room, dropped my bags, and collapsed into bed. I woke up early the next morning, as usual. After a quick shower, I headed down to grab some coffee from the lobby before starting my workday. As I walked through the parking lot, that white van was still there. In the light of day, I could see it was a plain cargo van with no markings or logos. The windows were tinted dark, making it impossible to see inside. For some reason, the sight of it made me uneasy. I quickened my pace to the coffee shop down the street. My meeting wasn't until the afternoon, so I spent the morning catching up on emails from my room. Around lunchtime, I decided to grab a sandwich from the deli across from the hotel. As I exited the lobby, my eyes were immediately drawn to the van. It was still there, in the exact same spot. A chill ran down my spine. Who leaves a van parked overnight at a hotel? I tried to shake off the feeling as I walked to the deli. The whole time I was ordering and eating my sandwich, I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see the van drive by. But there was no sign of it. On my way back, I decided to take a closer look. I casually strolled near the van, trying not to look suspicious. The windows were so dark I couldn't see anything inside. There was a thin layer of dust on the hood, like it hadn't been driven in a while. Just as I was about to head inside, I heard the distinct sound of a car door unlocking. I froze. The driver's side door opened slowly, and I caught a glimpse of a hand on the door handle. My heart racing, I hurried into the hotel without looking back. I took the stairs 2 at a time up to my room, slamming and locking the door behind me. I tried to calm myself down. I was being ridiculous. It was probably just a guest who happened to have a van. But why did they wait until I walked by to get out? And why had it been parked there so long? I forced myself to focus on preparing for my meeting. As I gathered my materials, I kept peeking out the window at the van. It didn't move. The meeting went well, but I was distracted the whole time. I kept thinking about that hand on the door handle. When it wrapped up around 5 p.m., I was eager to get back to my room and order some food. I didn't want to go out again. As I walked through the hotel parking lot, my blood ran cold. The van was gone. I practically ran to my room, my mind racing. Where did it go? Why now? I ordered a pizza and tried to distract myself with TV, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread in the pit of my stomach. Just after dark, I heard a vehicle pull into the lot. I peeked out the window and my heart stopped. The white van was back, parking in the same spot as before. I watched in horror as the driver's door opened. A tall figure in dark clothes stepped out, their face obscured by a baseball cap pulled low. They walked around to the back of the van and opened the rear doors. I couldn't see what they were doing, but after a few minutes they closed up the van and walked towards the hotel entrance. I scrambled away from the window, praying they hadn't seen me watching. I barely slept that night. Every sound had me jumping out of bed to check the parking lot. The van never moved. The next morning, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I was going to check out early and drive home, work be damned. I quickly packed up my things and headed to the lobby. As I approached the front desk, I noticed the night clerk was still there. Wasn't his shift supposed to be over? He looked exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes. "Checking out early?" he asked in a monotone. "Yeah, something came up at home," I lied. "Hey, do you know anything about that white van in the parking lot? It's been there for days." The clerk's eyes widened slightly. "What white van?" I felt the color drain from my face. "The cargo van parked right out front. It's been there since I checked in." He shook his head slowly. "Sir, there's no white van in our lot. I've been here all night and I haven't seen any van." My hands started to shake as I handed over my key card. I mumbled a thanks and practically ran out to my car. The van was gone. There wasn't even a trace that it had been there. No oil stains on the pavement, nothing. I peeled out of the parking lot, my heart pounding. As I merged onto the highway, I glanced in my rearview mirror. A white van was following close behind. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. This couldn't be happening. I sped up, weaving through traffic, trying to lose it. But every time I looked back, it was still there. For hours I drove aimlessly, taking random exits and back roads. The van stayed with me the whole time, always keeping the same distance. As the sun began to set, I was running low on gas and completely lost. I pulled into a rest stop, figuring at least there would be other people around. I parked and waited, watching the entrance. The van never came in. Exhausted and confused, I must have dozed off. I woke with a start as someone tapped on my window. It was a state trooper. "Everything all right, sir? We got a call about a suspicious vehicle." I looked around wildly. The rest stop was empty, except for my car and the troopers. "There was a white van following me," I stammered. "For hours. Did you see it?" The trooper frowned. "We haven't had any other vehicles come through here in the last couple hours. Are you sure you're feeling okay? Maybe you should get some rest." I nodded numbly, not knowing what else to say. The trooper gave me directions back to the highway and left. I sat there for a long time, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had I imagined it all? Was I losing my mind? Eventually, I started driving home. I kept checking my mirrors, but there was no sign of the van. When I finally got home, I collapsed into bed and slept for 14 hours straight. I called in sick the next day, still shaken. It's been a few weeks now, and I still don't know what to make of it all. I've gone over it 1,000 times in my head. Sometimes I convince myself it was all in my imagination. Too many long nights on the road catching up to me. But then I'll be driving and catch a glimpse of a white van in traffic, and that feeling of dread comes rushing back. I've started taking back roads everywhere I go, avoiding highways when I can. I haven't traveled for work since then. I'm not sure I ever will again, because deep down, I know that van is out there somewhere, and I can't shake the feeling that someday it's going to find me again. I had been driving for hours, exhausted from a long business trip, when I finally pulled into the parking lot of the Pinewood Inn. It was a small, unassuming motel on the outskirts of town. Not my first choice, but everywhere else was booked solid due to some local festival. As I grabbed my suitcase from the trunk, I noticed how eerily quiet it was. No cars passing on the nearby highway, no sounds of nature, just dead silence. The lobby was dimly lit and had a musty smell, like no one had been there in ages. I approached the front desk, where a lone man stood perfectly still, staring blankly ahead. He didn't seem to notice me at first, so I cleared my throat. "Excuse me, I'd like to check in, please." The man's head snapped towards me so quickly I nearly jumped. His eyes were wide and unblinking as he looked me up and down. Of course. Welcome to the Pinewood Inn. We've been expecting you." His voice was monotone and robotic. A chill ran down my spine. How could they have been expecting me? I hadn't made a reservation. "I'm sorry, there must be some mistake. I don't have a reservation," I said hesitantly. The man's face twitched into what I think was supposed to be a smile, but looked more like a grimace. "No mistake. We always have a room ready for guests like you." Before I could question him further, he spun around and grabbed a key from the wall behind him. "Room 237, top floor, end of the hall. Enjoy your stay." As I reached for the key, his ice-cold hand brushed against mine. I recoiled instinctively. "One more thing," he said, leaning in close. His breath smelled like decay. "We have a very special event tonight in the basement. All guests are invited. It would be in your best interest to attend." My heart was pounding now. Everything about this felt wrong. "Thanks, but I'm very tired. I think I'll just go to my room and get some sleep." His eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "As you wish, but I must insist you reconsider. It's quite an important gathering." I mumbled some vague reply and hurried towards the elevator, feeling his gaze boring into my back the entire time. As the door slid shut, I let out a shaky breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The elevator creaked and groaned as it ascended, the flickering fluorescent light casting strange shadows. When it finally reached the top floor, I practically ran to my room, fumbling with the key in my haste to get inside and lock the door behind me. The room was sparse and dated, with peeling wallpaper and a musty smell. But at that moment, it felt like a sanctuary. I did a quick search to make sure no one was hiding anywhere, then collapsed onto the bed, my mind racing. What the hell was going on in this place? Why did that receptionist act so strangely? And what was this event he was so insistent I attend? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they were just really enthusiastic about guest activities. Maybe the receptionist was new and nervous. But deep down I knew something was very, very wrong here. I decided to freshen up a bit and clear my head. The bathroom was small and dimly lit, with cracked tiles and a leaky faucet. As I splashed some water on my face, I heard a soft scratching sound coming from somewhere nearby. I froze, listening intently. There it was again, a faint scratching, like nails on wood. It seemed to be coming from inside the walls. Probably just a mouse or something, I told myself. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood up all the same. Back in the main room, I tried to distract myself by unpacking and checking my phone. No service, of course. I flipped on the ancient TV, but only got static on every channel. As I sat there in the quiet room, that feeling of wrongness grew stronger. I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. My eyes kept darting to the corners of the room, half expecting to see someone or something lurking in the shadows. A soft knock at the door made me nearly jump out of my skin. "Housekeeping," called a woman's voice. I hesitated. I hadn't called for housekeeping, and it seemed odd they'd be coming around so late. "No, thank you," I called back. "I'm fine for now." There was a long pause, then another knock, more insistent this time. "Sir, I really must insist on coming in to tidy up. It's hotel policy." My heart was racing again. I said, "No, thank you. Please go away." Another pause. Then I heard the sound of a key in the lock. Panic flooded through me. I leapt up and wedged a chair under the doorknob just as it started to open. The door pushed against the chair, stopping it from opening fully. "Sir, please let me in. I only want to help prepare your room." The woman's voice had taken on an eerie sing-song quality. "Go away!" I shouted. "I'm calling the police." An empty threat, since my phone had no service, but it seemed to work. After a moment, I heard footsteps retreating down the hall. I sank to the floor, shaking. What the hell was happening? This couldn't be normal hotel behavior. I needed to get out of here. I quickly repacked my bag, planning to sneak out and drive to the next town. But as I approached the door, I heard hushed voices in the hallway. "He's not cooperating. We need him at the gathering. The master will be displeased if he's not there. Perhaps we should use more forceful methods." I backed away from the door, my mind reeling. This was insane. I was trapped in some kind of cult hotel with people who wanted to force me to attend their creepy gathering. I looked around desperately for another way out. The window? But I was on the top floor, way too high to jump. I was trapped. As the minutes ticked by, I grew more and more paranoid. Every creak of the building, every shadow seemed menacing. The scratching in the walls grew louder, more frenzied, and underneath it all was a low, pulsing hum that I felt more than heard, as if the entire building was vibrating with some dark energy. I don't know how long I sat there, huddled in the corner, jumping at every sound. It felt like hours. My eyes kept being drawn to the analog clock on the nightstand. But something was wrong with it. The hands seemed to move erratically, sometimes creeping along normally, sometimes spinning wildly, sometimes moving backwards. Just when I thought I couldn't take the psychological torture anymore, all the sounds suddenly stopped. The silence was deafening. Then I heard it, heavy footsteps coming down the hall, slow, deliberate, getting closer and closer to my room. They stopped right outside my door. I held my breath, praying they would move on. A deep voice rumbled through the wood. "It's time. The master is waiting." The doorknob turned. The chair legs scraped against the floor as the door was forced open. Dark, robed figures filled the doorway. I caught a glimpse of pale, inhuman faces before strong hands grabbed me. I tried to scream, to fight back, but my body wouldn't respond. It was like I was paralyzed. They dragged me from the room and down the hall. Everything was a blur of shadowy figures and flickering lights. We descended stairs that seemed to go down much further than just to the ground floor. The air grew cold and damp. Finally, we entered a vast underground chamber. Hundreds of robed figures stood in concentric circles around a raised stone altar. Torches cast dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The low humming I'd felt earlier was much stronger here. It vibrated in my bones. I was forced to my knees before the altar. The circle of figures parted, and a tall, imposing figure approached. As it got closer, I realized with dawning horror that it wasn't human. Its proportions were all wrong, limbs too long, head misshapen. It moved with an unnatural fluidity. It reached out a clawed hand towards my face. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for whatever horror was about to happen. But suddenly, everything stopped. The humming cut off. The hand withdrew. When I opened my eyes, I was alone in my hotel room. Sunlight was streaming through the windows. I looked around in confusion. Had it all been a nightmare? But then I noticed the chair still wedged under the doorknob. And there, on the nightstand, was a piece of paper that hadn't been there before. With trembling hands, I unfolded it. In spidery handwriting, it said, "Your presence is still required. We will be waiting." I've never packed and left a place so quickly in my life. As I peeled out of the parking lot, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The receptionist was standing out front watching me go. He raised his hand in a wave, that unnatural smile on his face. I drove for hours, trying to put as much distance between me and that place as possible, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that somehow, someday, they would find me again. And next time, I might not be so lucky as to escape. I was exhausted after a long day of travel when I finally checked into the small roadside motel just outside of Albuquerque. The desk clerk barely looked up from his phone as he handed me the key to room 113. I trudged down the dimly lit hallway, eager to collapse into bed and get some much-needed rest before continuing my cross-country road trip in the morning. As I inserted the key and pushed open the door, I immediately sensed something was off. The room was stuffy and had a stale cigarette smell, despite being non-smoking. Clothes were strewn across the unmade bed, and empty beer cans littered the nightstand. My tired brain took a moment to process that this room was clearly already occupied. I was about to turn around and head back to the front desk when something caught my eye. A sleek black briefcase sitting on the rickety table by the window. Curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself drawn towards it. I knew I shouldn't snoop, but some instinct told me to take a closer look. With trembling hands, I unlatched the case. My eyes widened as I saw stacks of $100 bills bundled neatly inside. There had to be tens of thousands of dollars at least. Underneath the cash were file folders stuffed with documents. I pulled one out and skimmed it quickly, my heart starting to race. They appeared to be detailed plans for some kind of large-scale drug smuggling operation. A chill ran down my spine as the reality of what I'd stumbled upon hit me. This wasn't just some traveler's luggage. It belonged to dangerous criminals. And I was standing in their motel room holding incriminating evidence. Panic set in, and I shoved everything back into the briefcase, my mind racing. I had to get out of there immediately before whoever owned this stuff came back. But a horrible thought struck me. What if they were already on their way back to the room? What if they saw me leaving with their briefcase? I peeked out the window and scanned the parking lot. No sign of anyone yet, but every passing headlight made me flinch. I knew I couldn't just leave the briefcase there. If these were truly dangerous criminals, they might hurt or kill the next unsuspecting guest who stumbled into this room. And selfishly, I worried about my own fingerprints now being all over the case and documents inside. Before I could second-guess myself, I grabbed the briefcase and bolted out of the room. I speed-walked down the hall, trying to look casual while my heart pounded in my chest. The same bored clerk was still at the front desk, not even glancing up as I passed. I made it to my car and tossed the briefcase onto the passenger seat, fumbling with shaking hands to get the key in the ignition. As I peeled out of the parking lot, I kept obsessively checking my rearview mirror, convinced at any moment I'd see headlights gaining on me. I drove aimlessly for nearly an hour, taking random turns down side streets to make sure I wasn't being followed. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do next. I couldn't go to the police. How could I explain having the briefcase without making myself look guilty? But I also couldn't just keep driving forever with stolen criminal evidence. Eventually, I pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner, needing to stop and think. I left the briefcase hidden under a blanket in my trunk and went inside, ordering coffee with shaking hands. As I sat in a booth, I pulled out my phone and started searching for news about any major criminal busts or manhunts in the area. Nothing jumped out at me. I must have looked a mess because the kindly older waitress kept refilling my coffee and asking if I was all right. I mumbled some excuse about being tired from driving all day. In reality, I was running through endless scenarios in my head, each one worse than the last. What if the criminals had already discovered their briefcase missing and were searching for me? What if they had connections with local law enforcement and had put out an APB on my car? What if I was eventually caught with all this evidence and ended up in prison myself? My imagination was in overdrive, conjuring up terrifying possibilities. After a few hours and way too much caffeine, I knew I had to make a decision. I couldn't keep driving aimlessly forever. I also couldn't risk going back to the motel to return the briefcase. For all I knew, the criminals were staking it out by now, looking for whoever took their stuff. In the end, I decided the only option was to get as far away as possible. I'd drive straight through to my original destination on the East Coast, over 1,500 miles away. Once there, I'd find someplace remote to ditch the briefcase where it hopefully wouldn't be found for a long time, if ever. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was the best I could come up with in my panicked state. I paid my bill and hurried back to my car, constantly looking over my shoulder. The sun was just starting to rise as I merged onto the interstate heading east. I drove for 18 hours straight that day, only stopping for gas and to use the restroom. Every vehicle that lingered behind me for too long sent a surge of fear through my body. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched and followed, even though logically I knew it was unlikely. How would the criminals even know which direction I went? But anxiety and paranoia had taken hold, twisting my thoughts into knots. That night, I pulled into a rest stop to try and get a few hours of sleep. But every sound jolted me awake, car doors slamming, the rumble of passing trucks. I gave up after less than 2 hours and got back on the road, figuring it was safer to keep moving. The next day and a half passed in a blur of endless highways, gas station coffee, and gnawing fear. I was beyond exhausted, but terrified to stop for more than a few minutes at a time. In my sleep-deprived state, my mind kept conjuring images of menacing figures lurking around every corner. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I crossed into my home state. I was running on fumes, both my gas tank and my own energy reserves nearly empty. But a spark of hope ignited as I realized I was almost at my destination. Just a little bit further, and I could get rid of this briefcase that had become like a 50-pound weight around my neck. I drove deep into a heavily forested state park, going as far down the winding back roads as I dared. When I couldn't go any further by car, I grabbed the briefcase and hiked another mile into the woods. My legs were shaking from exhaustion and stress by the time I found a suitably remote spot. Using a fallen branch, I dug a deep hole and buried the briefcase, piling rocks on top to further obscure the disturbed ground. As I worked, I kept imagining I heard footsteps or voices in the distance. But each time I whirled around to look, there was nothing there but trees and shadows. When it was done, I stumbled back to my car in a daze. I'd done it. I'd gotten rid of the evidence and made it home safely. But as I drove the last few miles to my house, I realized this nightmare was far from over. How long would I be looking over my shoulder, wondering if today was the day the criminals would track me down? Would I ever feel truly safe again? And what if someday a hiker or animal uncovered that briefcase? Would it somehow get traced back to me? It's been 6 months now since that fateful night at the motel. Sometimes I can almost convince myself it was all just a bad dream. But then I'll see a black sedan lingering on my street or catch a glimpse of a face in a crowd that looks vaguely menacing, and the fear comes rushing back. I've thought about going to the police countless times, but what proof do I have now? It would be my word against nothing, and a small part of me is still terrified of getting caught up in whatever criminal enterprise I stumbled into that night. So I live with this secret weighing on me, jumping at shadows and struggling to sleep. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again. All I know is that one split-second decision in a dingy motel room changed the course of my life forever. I can only hope that briefcase stays buried, along with the truth of what really happened, for good. On my second night there, I decided to grab dinner at the hotel restaurant. It was pretty quiet, just a few other guests scattered around. I sat at a small table near the back, ordered a steak, and settled in with my phone to catch up on some emails while I waited for my food. That's when I overheard them, 2 men at the table behind me speaking in low voices. At first I tried to tune them out, but then a few words caught my attention. Security cameras, safe codes, getaway car. My breath caught in my throat as I realized they were discussing plans for a robbery. I tried to stay calm and act natural, but my heart was racing. Should I alert hotel security? Call the police? I didn't want to make a scene if I had misunderstood. So I just sat there, barely touching my food when it arrived, straining to hear more details without being obvious. "We'll hit the main vault at 2 a.m. sharp," one of the men was saying. "Johnson disables the alarms, you crack the safe. In and out in 10 minutes tops." "What about the night manager?" the other asked. "Taken care of. He'll be indisposed." A chill ran down my spine. This was real. They were going to rob the hotel, and it sounded like they might hurt someone in the process. I had to do something. As soon as the men got up to leave, I hurried to the restroom and locked myself in a stall. With shaking hands, I called the local police and relayed everything I had overheard. They thanked me and said they'd send officers right away. I waited in the bathroom for a good 15 minutes, not wanting to risk running into the criminals. When I finally emerged, the restaurant had mostly cleared out. I decided to head straight up to my room and lay low for the night. As I was waiting for the elevator, a burly man in a security uniform approached me. "Excuse me, sir, can I have a word?" he asked gruffly. My stomach dropped. Had he seen me make the call? Was he working with the robbers? Sure, I stammered. "What's this about?" He gestured for me to follow him down a hallway. "Just need to ask you a few questions about a disturbance reported earlier." Alarm bells were going off in my head. This didn't feel right. As we turned a corner, I caught a glimpse of a gun tucked in the back of his waistband, definitely not standard hotel security gear. In that split second, I made a decision. I turned and ran. I heard him swear and start after me, but I had a head start. I sprinted for the stairwell, taking the steps 2 at a time. I could hear heavy footsteps and shouting behind me. My room was on the 8th floor. I burst out of the stairwell and raced down the hallway, fumbling for my key card. Just as I reached my door, I heard the stairwell door slam open. I got inside and locked the door, my chest heaving. What the hell was happening? How did they know I had called the police? I grabbed my phone to call 911 again, but there was no signal. They must be jamming it somehow. Panic rising, I looked around frantically for a way out. The window? No, too high up. There was a loud bang on the door. "Open up! Hotel security!" Yeah, right. I wedged a chair under the doorknob and looked for a weapon. The best I could find was the metal ice bucket. The banging continued, growing more insistent. I heard multiple voices now. They were going to break through any second. Just then, I remembered the adjoining door to the next room. I wrenched it open, praying it wasn't locked from the other side. By some miracle, it opened. I darted through just as I heard my main door splinter. Heart pounding, I raced through the empty adjoining room and out into the hallway. I could hear angry shouts behind me as they realized I had escaped. I ran for the elevators, repeatedly mashing the call button. Come on, come on. The doors finally opened and I dove inside, frantically pressing the lobby button. As the doors slid shut, I saw 2 men round the corner, their eyes locking onto me with murderous intent. The elevator seemed to move in slow motion. I was trembling, my mind racing. What if they were waiting for me in the lobby? Should I get off on a different floor? Before I could decide, the doors opened onto the lobby. I tentatively poked my head out. It looked normal. A few guests milling about, staff at the front desk. No sign of my pursuers. I speed-walked toward the main entrance, trying not to draw attention. Just as I thought I was in the clear, I heard a shout behind me. "There he is! Stop that man!" I broke into a run, shoving past a startled bellhop. I burst out the front doors onto the street, the cool night air hitting my face. Where to go? I picked a direction at random and sprinted down the sidewalk. I could hear footsteps pounding after me. I darted across the street, narrowly avoiding being hit by a taxi. Cars honked as I weaved through traffic. I turned down an alleyway, hoping to lose them. It was dark and narrow, lined with dumpsters. I ducked behind one, trying to quiet my ragged breathing. Heavy footsteps approached. "Where'd he go?" a gruff voice asked. "Check behind the dumpsters," another replied. Shit. I looked around desperately for an escape route. There, a rusty fire escape ladder on the building to my left. I launched myself at it, scrambling up as quietly as I could. I had just pulled myself onto the first landing when a beam of light swept across the alley below. I froze, pressing myself against the wall. "Nothing here," one of the men called out. "He must have gone the other way." I held my breath as their footsteps receded. Only when the alley had been silent for several minutes did I allow myself to relax slightly. What now? I was too scared to go back to the hotel or try to retrieve my things. I had my wallet and phone, but the cell signal was still jammed. I needed to get somewhere safe and contact the police again. I climbed higher up the fire escape, hoping to get a better vantage point. When I reached the roof, I cautiously peered over the edge. The street below was quiet, no sign of my pursuers. In the distance, I could see flashing police lights. Were they responding to my earlier call? I had to try to reach them. I made my way down to street level and started jogging toward the lights. As I got closer, I saw several squad cars surrounding the entrance to my hotel. Relief washed over me. I approached one of the officers, my hands raised. "Officer, I'm the one who called earlier about the robbery. Please, I need help. They've been chasing me." The cop looked at me skeptically. "Sir, we responded to reports of a disturbance, but hotel security says it was just a drunk guest causing problems. They have no record of any 911 call about a robbery." My mouth fell open in disbelief. "No, that's not possible. I heard them planning it in the restaurant. A security guard chased me, but he wasn't really security. Please, you have to believe me." The officer sighed. "Sir, have you been drinking tonight? Why don't you come with me and we'll sort this out?" As he reached for my arm, movement near the hotel entrance caught my eye. The two men from the elevator, the ones who had chased me, were talking to another cop. One of them pointed in my direction. Ice flooded my veins. They had infiltrated the police too. This went deeper than I could have imagined. I yanked my arm away from the officer. "I'm sorry, I have to go," I shouted, taking off running once again. "Hey, stop!" the cop yelled after me, but I didn't look back. I ran for what felt like hours, ducking down side streets and doubling back to throw off any pursuit. Eventually, I found an all-night diner and ducked inside, collapsing into a booth. The waitress gave me a concerned look as she brought me a coffee. I must have looked a mess, sweaty, disheveled, wild-eyed with fear. I sat there until dawn, jumping at every sound, terrified that at any moment they would burst through the door. But no one came. As the sun rose, my phone suddenly chimed with a flood of missed calls and messages. The signal was back. I hesitated, then dialed 911. This time I got through to a dispatcher. I haltingly tried to explain everything that had happened. They said they would send someone to take my statement. I'm writing this now from a small motel on the outskirts of town. I'm still not sure who to trust. Was it all just a misunderstanding, an elaborate prank, or did I really uncover some massive criminal conspiracy? All I know is that I'm never staying at that hotel again. And next time I overhear a suspicious conversation, I'm minding my own damn business. I was in town for a business conference and decided to stay at this quaint little hotel on the outskirts of the city. It seemed charming at first, all rustic wood paneling and vintage decor. The front desk clerk was friendly enough when I checked in, though looking back there was something a bit off about him. He kept fidgeting with the key cards and glancing nervously at the security cameras. Anyway, I got to my room on the 3rd floor and settled in for the night. I remember triple-checking that the door was locked before I went to bed. I've always been a bit paranoid about hotel security. I must have fallen asleep pretty quickly, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by the sound of the door opening. At first, I thought I was dreaming. You know that weird state between sleep and waking, where things don't seem quite real. But then I heard footsteps and saw a shadow moving across the room. My heart started pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I was paralyzed with fear, barely able to breathe. The shadow got closer and closer to the bed. I could make out the silhouette of a man in the darkness. Just as he was about to reach the side of the bed, I managed to find my voice and let out a blood-curdling scream. The intruder jumped back, startled. I fumbled for the bedside lamp and turned it on. There was a man standing there, mid-30s, scruffy beard, wide-eyed with shock. He was holding something in his hand. It took me a second to realize it was my wallet. "What the hell are you doing in my room?" I yelled, my voice shaking. He stammered something about thinking it was his room, but I could tell he was lying. Before I could say anything else, he bolted for the door and ran out. I was shaking uncontrollably at this point. I jumped out of bed and double-checked that the door was locked. How had he gotten in? I distinctly remembered locking it. I called down to the front desk in a panic, my words tumbling out in a jumbled mess as I tried to explain what happened. The night manager rushed up to my room. He seemed genuinely concerned and horrified by what I told him. He radioed security and they did a sweep of the hotel, but there was no sign of the intruder. The manager insisted on moving me to a different room for the night. I was too scared to be alone, so I asked if someone from staff could stay with me until morning. A kind older woman from housekeeping volunteered to sit in an armchair by the door. I didn't sleep a wink that night. Every little noise made me jump. I kept replaying the incident in my head, imagining all the horrible things that could have happened. When morning finally came, I went down to the lobby to check out early. I wanted nothing more than to get the hell out of there. But as I was waiting to speak to the manager, I overheard a heated conversation between two staff members. "I can't believe Jake was selling master keys," one of them whispered. "How long do you think this has been going on?" My blood ran cold. Master keys? I stepped closer, straining to hear more. Apparently, one of the night clerks had been making copies of the hotel's master key cards and selling them to criminals. They'd use the keys to break into rooms and rob guests while they slept. I felt sick to my stomach. That explained how the man got into my locked room. Who knows how many other guests had been victimized? I confronted the manager about what I'd overheard. At first he tried to deny it, but when I threatened to go to the police, he broke down and admitted everything. The night clerk, Jake, had been arrested that morning. They found dozens of copied key cards in his apartment, along with stolen valuables from hotel guests. He'd been running this scheme for months. I was beyond furious. How could the hotel have such lax security? How had no one noticed this was happening? The manager begged me not to go public with the story, offering me free stays and loyalty points. But I wasn't interested in hush money. I wanted justice for all the guests who'd had their privacy and safety violated. I insisted on filing a police report and giving a statement. The next few weeks were a blur of police interviews, lawyers, and journalists calling for comment. The story blew up in the local media. Other victims started coming forward with similar experiences. The hotel ended up facing multiple lawsuits and had to completely overhaul their security protocols. Jake is now serving time in prison for his crimes. As for me, I still have nightmares about that night. The image of that stranger standing over my bed is seared into my brain. I get anxious staying in hotels now, always wondering if I'm really safe. I know rationally that what happened to me was a freak occurrence, that most hotels have strong security measures in place. But that lingering fear is hard to shake. I find myself obsessively checking locks, looking for hidden cameras, pushing furniture in front of doors. I can't relax in hotel rooms anymore. Every noise puts me on high alert. Sometimes I wonder about that man who broke into my room. Was he just a petty thief looking for easy cash? Or did he have more sinister intentions? The thought makes my skin crawl. I'm angry at Jake for betraying guests' trust in such an egregious way. But I'm also angry at the hotel for not having better safeguards in place. How did no one notice all these break-ins happening? Were they just willfully ignoring it? The whole experience has made me much more cautious and aware of my surroundings. I'm constantly on guard now, always looking over my shoulder. In some ways, I feel like my sense of safety and security was stolen that night along with my wallet. I know I need to work on moving past this trauma. My friends and family tell me I can't live in fear forever. And logically, I know they're right. But it's hard to let go of that visceral panic I felt waking up to a stranger in my room. I've started seeing a therapist to work through some of this anxiety. She's helping me develop coping mechanisms and gradually expose myself to triggering situations. It's a slow process, but I'm hopeful that eventually I'll be able to travel and stay in hotels without constant fear. For now, though, I'm sticking close to home. No more business trips or vacations for a while. I need to feel safe in my own space before I can consider venturing out again. I share my story as a warning to others. Always trust your instincts if something feels off. Don't be afraid to ask questions or demand better security measures. And remember that even in seemingly safe places, you can never be too careful. I hope that by speaking out, I can prevent others from going through what I did. No one should have to experience that violation of privacy and safety. Hotels need to do better at protecting their guests. As for me, I'm taking it one day at a time, slowly rebuilding my sense of security and trust in the world. But I'll never forget that night at the Hillside Inn and how quickly an ordinary business trip turned into a living nightmare. The neon vacancy sign flickered erratically as I stepped out of my car. The air felt thick and oppressive, despite the cool autumn night. I clutched my notepad tightly as I made my way to the office, gravel crunching under my feet. The bell above the door jingled as I entered. An older man with thinning gray hair sat behind the desk, barely glancing up from his newspaper. "Help you?" he grunted. "Hi, I'm Jack Thompson from the Gazette," I said, flashing my press badge. "I'm here for the interview about the renovations." He peered at me over his glasses. "Oh, right. That's tonight. Make it quick, will you? Got a busy night ahead." I nodded and pulled out my voice recorder as he reluctantly set aside his paper. We were about 10 minutes into a rather dull conversation about new carpeting when a loud engine roar cut through the quiet night. The owner's head snapped up, eyes widening. "Shit," he muttered. "Interview's over. You need to leave. Now." "But we're not finished." I started to protest. "I said get out," he snapped, already rushing towards the door. Confused and a bit shaken, I gathered my things and followed him outside. A large black SUV with tinted windows had pulled up near the office. Two burly men in dark suits climbed out, surveying the area with cold, calculating eyes. The owner hurried over to them, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tension was palpable. One of the men glanced in my direction and I quickly averted my gaze, pretending to be absorbed in checking my phone. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, but the journalist in me was intrigued. What the hell was going on here? I casually made my way to my car, then ducked down behind it to observe. The owner led the men to a room on the far end of the motel. They disappeared inside for several long minutes. When they emerged, they were carrying large duffel bags that looked suspiciously heavy. My heart was racing as I watched them load the bags into the SUV. This was clearly some kind of illicit operation. Drugs? Weapons? My mind raced with possibilities. Just as I was debating whether to try and get a photo, my phone let out a loud chime. I frantically fumbled to silence it. But it was too late. One of the men whipped his head in my direction, eyes narrowing. "Hey!" he shouted. "You there behind the car!" Panic surged through me. I leapt up and dove into my car, hands shaking as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life just as the men started sprinting towards me. I slammed on the gas, tires squealing as I peeled out of the parking lot. In my rearview mirror, I saw them jump into the SUV and peel out after me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I weaved through traffic, running red lights and praying I wouldn't crash. The SUV stayed right on my tail, engine growling menacingly. I took a sharp turn down a narrow side street, hoping to lose them. But they matched my every move. These guys were professionals. My palms were sweating as I gripped the steering wheel. I had no idea where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. Houses and storefronts blurred past as I pushed my old Honda to its limits. After what felt like hours but was probably only 15 minutes, I finally managed to lose them by cutting through a mall parking garage. I didn't slow down until I was on the highway heading out of town. As the adrenaline began to fade, the reality of what just happened hit me. I had stumbled onto something big and dangerous. These guys clearly didn't want any witnesses. If they had caught me, I shuddered to think what might have happened. I drove for hours, paranoid that they might still be looking for me. It was nearly dawn by the time I finally felt safe enough to stop at a rest area. My hands were still shaking as I gulped down some water. What the hell had I gotten myself into? Part of me wanted to forget the whole thing and pretend it never happened. But I knew I couldn't just let this go. Whatever was happening at that motel was serious. Over the next few days, I discreetly started digging. I called in some favors with contacts at the police department and did some deep research on the motel's history. It turned out the Starlight had changed ownership several times in recent years. Each time it was purchased by a shell company that led to dead ends. Classic money laundering setup. I also discovered there had been a string of disappearances in the area over the past year. Mostly drifters and sex workers, people who wouldn't be missed. The cops hadn't connected the dots, but I was starting to see a disturbing pattern. My investigation led me down a rabbit hole of organized crime, human trafficking, and corruption that went deeper than I ever imagined. The Starlight was just one small piece of a much larger operation. I knew I was in way over my head. This was the kind of story that got journalists killed. But I couldn't just walk away. I had a responsibility to expose the truth and try to help those who were suffering. So I kept digging, always looking over my shoulder. I installed security cameras at my apartment and started varying my routines. Paranoia became my constant companion. It's been 3 months since that night at the motel. I'm close to breaking the story wide open, but I know the closer I get, the more danger I'm in. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I hear footsteps outside my door. Every black SUV I see sends a chill down my spine. I've thought about running, about giving up the story and disappearing, but I can't. I'm in too deep now. I don't know how this will end, but I do know that night changed my life forever. I stumbled onto something dark and terrifying, and now I can't look away. All I can do is keep pushing forward and hope that somehow, some way, the truth will come out. I've arranged for this account to be published if anything happens to me. If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it. But maybe, just maybe, my work will make a difference. That's all any journalist can hope for in the end. I'd been staying at the Oakwood Inn for about a week on a business trip. when things took a bizarre and frightening turn. It was a fairly nice hotel in a small city, nothing too fancy, but clean and comfortable enough. I was settled into my usual routine of heading out early for meetings, coming back to the room in the evenings to catch up on emails, and grabbing dinner at the hotel restaurant. On this particular evening, I returned to my room around 6 p.m. after a long day of client presentations. As I swiped my keycard and pushed open the door, I immediately sensed something was off. There was a large manila envelope sitting on the desk that definitely hadn't been there when I left that morning. My first thought was that maybe housekeeping had left it, but that didn't make sense. Why would they put anything on my desk? I cautiously approached and saw my name handwritten on the front in black marker. A chill ran down my spine. How did someone get into my locked room to leave this? With shaking hands, I picked up the envelope. It felt weighty, like it was stuffed full of papers. For a moment, I debated whether I should even open it or if I should call the front desk first. Curiosity got the better of me, though, and I carefully unsealed the flap. Inside was a thick stack of documents, at least 50 pages of what looked like financial statements, contracts, and internal memos. As I flipped through, my eyes widened in shock. These appeared to be highly confidential documents from Syntech Industries, the very company I was in town to potentially sign a major deal with. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. How on earth did these end up in my hotel room? I certainly hadn't brought them. I'd only had preliminary discussions with Syntech so far. Nothing that would warrant them sharing anything this sensitive. As I scanned the papers more closely, I realized they contained damning evidence of major financial fraud and illegal activities within Syntech. Cooked books, bribery of government officials, deliberate environmental violations. It was all laid out in black and white. My hands were trembling as I set the stack back down on the desk. I felt physically ill. Someone had purposely left these for me to find, but why? Was I being set up somehow? Or was this a whistleblower trying to expose the company's wrongdoing? I paced back and forth across the small room, my mind spinning. Should I call the police, the FBI, my own company's legal team? But how could I explain having these documents in my possession? As the implications started to sink in, panic began to set in. I was suddenly hyper-aware of every little sound in the hallway outside my door. The ice machine down the hall clanking, footsteps passing by. Was someone watching me, following me? I peered out the peephole but saw nothing unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. I double-checked that the deadbolt and security latch were engaged on the door. My cell phone buzzed on the nightstand, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. It was a text from an unknown number. Hope you found the package interesting. More to come. Don't trust anyone. I stared at the message in disbelief. This was really happening. Someone was toying with me, but to what end? I tried calling the number back, but got an automated "number not in service" message. For the next hour, I sat frozen in the desk chair, afraid to touch the documents again, but unable to take my eyes off them. My mind raced through possible scenarios, each one worse than the last. Was I being framed, blackmailed? Had I somehow stumbled into some kind of corporate espionage plot? I knew I should probably alert hotel security or the police, but I was paralyzed with indecision. What if involving authorities only made things worse? What if whoever was behind this had people on the inside? The text had warned me not to trust anyone. As night fell outside my window, the shadows in the room seemed to grow deeper and more menacing. Every creak of the old building made me flinch. I couldn't bring myself to turn on the TV or any music. I needed to stay alert, listening for any sign of danger. Around 9 p.m., my work phone rang. It was my boss back at headquarters. With everything going on, I had completely forgotten our scheduled check-in call. I cleared my throat and tried to sound normal as I answered. "Hey Jim, how's everything going out there? Making progress with Syntech?" he asked cheerfully. Yeah, it's going fine," I lied, my voice shaky. "Just, reviewing some documents they sent over." "Great, glad to hear it," Jim replied. "Hey, did you get a chance to look at those updated sales projections I emailed this afternoon? The board is really pushing for—" I let his voice fade into the background as I stared at the pile of incriminating documents on my desk. How could I possibly focus on sales projections at a time like this? But I couldn't tell Jim what was really going on. I had no idea who I could trust. After somehow stumbling through the rest of the call, I hung up in a cold sweat. The situation felt increasingly surreal. Here I was, sitting on a powder keg of corporate crimes, while the rest of the world went about business as usual. As the night wore on, my anxiety and paranoia continued to build. Every sound from the hallway made me jump. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of my vision. I was exhausted, but too terrified to even consider sleeping. Around midnight, I heard a series of loud thunks from the room next door, followed by muffled voices. I pressed my ear to the wall, but couldn't make out what was being said. Were they talking about me? Planning something? I briefly considered making a run for it, packing up my stuff and checking out in the middle of the night. But where would I go? And wouldn't fleeing just make me look guilty if this was all some kind of setup? So I stayed put, huddled in the desk chair as the hours ticked by. I kept the lights on and my eyes fixed on the door, jumping at every little noise. The mysterious envelope sat untouched on the desk, a ticking time bomb of secrets. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky outside, I was startled by a sharp knock at my door. My heart leapt into my throat. "Housekeeping!" called a cheery voice. I stayed frozen, hardly daring to breathe. After a moment, I heard the squeak of a cleaning cart rolling further down the hall. The close call left me shaken. I couldn't stay holed up in this room forever. I needed to figure out my next move before I completely lost my mind. With trembling hands, I began to leaf through the documents again, hoping to find some clue as to who might have left them or what they wanted from me. As I flipped past financial statements and internal memos, a small scrap of paper fluttered to the floor. I bent to pick it up and saw a handwritten note. "Parking garage, level B2, white van, 10 a.m., come alone, or else." I checked my watch. It was just after 7 a.m. now. My stomach churned with dread. In less than 3 hours, I was apparently expected to meet whoever was behind all this. But what choice did I have? Maybe this was my only chance to get answers and find a way out of this nightmare. The next few hours passed in a haze of anxiety and indecision. I paced the room, rehearsing what I might say, imagining every possible scenario. Several times I picked up the phone to call for help, but always set it back down. The warning not to trust anyone echoed in my head. At 9:45, I finally steeled my nerves and left the room, trying to act casual as I made my way to the elevator. My palms were sweating as I descended to the parking garage levels. With each floor that passed, I felt like I was willingly walking into a trap. The garage was dimly lit and eerily quiet as I stepped out onto level B2. Rows of parked cars stretched into the shadows. I scanned for any sign of a white van, my footsteps echoing on the concrete. Then I spotted it, a nondescript white cargo van parked in a far corner. As I cautiously approached, the back doors suddenly swung open. A man in a dark suit climbed out, his face obscured by the van's shadow. "Do you have the documents?" he asked in a low voice. I nodded mutely, clutching the envelope to my chest. "Good. Get in. We have a lot to discuss." Heart pounding, I climbed into the back of the van. The doors slammed shut behind me, plunging me into darkness. Whatever happened next, I knew my life would never be the same. I was on a business trip to Chicago, staying at the Lakeview Hotel downtown. It was a pretty standard hotel, nothing fancy but clean and comfortable enough. I checked in on Monday evening after my flight got in. The front desk clerk was polite if a bit distracted, handed me my key card, and directed me to the elevators. I made my way up to my room on the 8th floor, unpacked a bit, and settled in for the night. The next morning, I woke up feeling groggy and disoriented. As I slowly came to, I realized something was very wrong. The room I was in looked completely different from the one I'd fallen asleep in. The layout, the decor, even the view out the window, it was all wrong. At first I thought maybe I'd sleepwalked into the wrong room somehow, but that didn't make any sense. The door would have been locked. I stumbled out of bed in a panic, heart racing. None of my belongings were anywhere to be seen. Not my suitcase, not my laptop, not even the clothes I'd been wearing. I was in different pajamas that I didn't recognize. The bathroom was stocked with toiletries, but they weren't mine. Trying to stay calm, I picked up the hotel phone to call the front desk, but when I dialed, all I got was static. I tried again. Same result. My cell phone was nowhere to be found either. I was starting to feel seriously freaked out. I threw on the bathrobe hanging in the closet and cautiously opened the door to peek out into the hallway. It looked similar to the one from the night before, but something about it felt off. The carpet pattern was different. The lighting fixtures weren't the same. Even the room numbers looked wrong. I was apparently in room 412 now instead of 823. Unsure what else to do, I made my way to the elevator and went down to the lobby. The whole time my mind was racing. Had I been drugged? Kidnapped? Was this some kind of elaborate prank? None of it made any sense. When I got to the lobby, things only got weirder. It looked similar to how I remembered, but again, little details were off. The furniture was arranged differently. The artwork on the walls had changed. Even the uniforms the staff wore were a different style and color. I approached the front desk, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained my situation to the clerk. But as I talked, I saw confusion and then concern growing on her face. She pulled up the reservation system on her computer and informed me that there was no record of me ever checking in. Not only that, but they had no reservation under my name at all. I insisted that there must be some mistake. I described the clerk who had checked me in the night before, showed them my driver's license, even offered to show them the emails confirming my reservation. But the clerk just shook her head. She said no one matching that description worked there, and that my license wasn't showing up as valid in their system. By this point, I was in full-blown panic mode. I demanded to speak to a manager, my voice rising. The clerk looked alarmed and called security. Within minutes, 2 large men in uniforms approached and asked me to calm down. I tried to explain the situation to them, but they just exchanged worried glances. One of them gently suggested that perhaps I was confused or having some kind of episode. They offered to call me a cab or help me contact someone. But I had no phone, no wallet, no way to prove who I was or where I was supposed to be. I felt like I was going insane. In desperation, I asked to use their phone to call my office. Surely my co-workers could confirm who I was and why I was in Chicago. The manager reluctantly agreed and dialed the number for me. But when someone answered, they had no idea who I was. They insisted there was no one by my name working for the company. At that point, I think I started to have a full-on breakdown. Nothing made sense. It was like my entire identity, my whole life, had been erased overnight. The security guards ended up escorting me to a small office to wait while they figured out what to do with me. I sat there for what felt like hours, alternating between panic and numbness. Eventually, a police officer showed up. He questioned me extensively, but I could tell he didn't believe a word I was saying. How could he? I had no ID, no possessions, no proof of anything I was claiming. In the end, they decided to take me to the hospital for evaluation. I spent the next few days there undergoing all kinds of tests: physical, neurological, psychological. But they couldn't find anything wrong with me, other than my apparent delusions about who I was and where I'd come from. I kept insisting that I wasn't crazy, that something impossible had happened to me. But the more I talked, the more concerned the doctors looked. They started discussing treatment options, medication, long-term care plans. I felt utterly helpless and alone. On the third day, just when I was starting to wonder if maybe I really had lost my mind, everything changed again. I woke up back in my original hotel room, surrounded by all my belongings, as if nothing had ever happened. My phone was there, full of missed calls and messages from worried coworkers wondering why I'd missed my meetings. I rushed down to the lobby in a daze. The original clerk was there, recognized me immediately. All my reservation info was in the system. It was like those 3 nightmarish days had never happened at all. To this day, I have no explanation for what occurred. Was it all an elaborate hallucination? Some kind of shared delusion? A glitch in reality itself? I've gone over it 1,000 times in my head, and I still can't make sense of it. All I know is that for those 3 days, it felt completely, terrifyingly real. And a part of me is still haunted by the thought that at any moment I could wake up and find myself erased from existence again. I don't think I'll ever feel truly secure in my own identity again after that experience. It's left me questioning everything I thought I knew about reality and my place in it. I'm sharing this story not because I expect anyone to believe me, but because I need to get it out. I need to know I'm not alone, that maybe someone out there has experienced something similar. Because the alternative, that I really did lose my mind for those 3 days, is almost too frightening to contemplate. So if you're reading this and it resonates with you at all, please reach out. Maybe together we can start to make sense of these impossible experiences that defy all logic and reason. Because I don't think I can go on pretending it never happened. The memory of those 3 days when I ceased to exist will haunt me for the rest of my life. The night clerk barely looked up from his phone as he handed me the key to room 113. I dragged my suitcase down the dimly lit hallway, found my room, and fumbled with the lock. As soon as I stepped inside, I was hit with the musty smell of old carpet and stale cigarette smoke. The room was small and shabby, with faded floral wallpaper and a sagging queen bed. But I was too tired to care. I tossed my bag on the floor, kicked off my shoes, and flopped face first onto the bed. That's when I noticed something odd. As I landed on the mattress, I felt the floor beneath it shift slightly. At first I thought I was imagining things in my exhausted state, but curiosity got the better of me, and I rolled off the bed to investigate. Kneeling down, I ran my hand over the dingy carpet. Sure enough, there was a slight give to it, like it wasn't fully attached to the floor underneath. Heart starting to race, I peeled back the edge of the carpet. To my shock, I saw the outline of what looked like a trap door. My fatigue instantly evaporated, replaced by a surge of adrenaline. What the hell was this? Some kind of cellar access? A storage space? Or something more sinister? Every horror movie I'd ever seen flashed through my mind. But I couldn't stop myself from investigating further. With trembling hands, I grabbed the metal ring on the trapdoor and pulled. It opened with a groan, revealing a dark hole and the top of a ladder descending into blackness. The musty smell grew stronger, mixed with damp earth and something metallic. I sat frozen for a moment, trying to decide what to do. The smart thing would be to close it back up, check out immediately, and find another motel. But morbid curiosity overrode my common sense. I had to know what was down there. Hands shaking, I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. Taking a deep breath, I lowered myself onto the ladder and started climbing down. The rungs were cold and slick with moisture. As I descended, the darkness seemed to press in around me, swallowing up the beam of my flashlight. After what felt like an eternity, my feet finally touched solid ground. I swung my light around, trying to get my bearings. I was in some kind of tunnel, the walls packed earth reinforced with wooden beams. It extended in both directions, disappearing into inky blackness. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to climb out of this nightmare and never look back. But I was in too deep now. I had to see where this led. I chose a direction at random and started walking, my footsteps echoing ominously. The air grew colder and damper the further I went. Every few yards I'd come across branch tunnels splitting off in different directions. It was like a maze down here. After a few minutes of walking, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Mounted on the wall was a small security camera, its red light blinking steadily as it tracked my movements. Someone was watching. Panic started to set in. What kind of place was this? Who had built these tunnels and why? I quickened my pace, no longer caring about stealth. I just wanted to find a way out of this underground labyrinth. As I hurried along, I began to notice other disturbing details. Thick power cables ran along the ceiling. Heavy steel doors were set into the walls at irregular intervals, each one padlocked shut. And everywhere, more of those blinking cameras. Just as I was considering turning back, I rounded a corner and saw a faint glow up ahead. Hope surged through me. Maybe this was a way out. I broke into a run, my footsteps thundering in the confined space. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't daylight. It was coming from underneath another door, this one slightly ajar. Muffled voices drifted out. I crept forward, heart in my throat, and peered through the crack. What I saw made me recoil in horror. The room beyond was some kind of control center, banks of monitors lining the walls. Each screen showed a different motel room, including mine, the trapdoor still gaping open. Two men in dark clothes sat at a central console, speaking in low voices as they manipulated the cameras. To their right was a bank of filing cabinets, and on a table, stacks of cash, drugs, and what looked like fake passports. I must have made a sound, because suddenly, both men turned and looked right at the door. For a split second, our eyes met through the crack. Then survival instinct kicked in and I ran. I sprinted back the way I'd come, no longer caring about noise or stealth. I could hear shouts and pounding footsteps behind me as the men gave chase. Panic gave me speed as I retraced my steps through the tunnels, praying I wouldn't take a wrong turn. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I saw the bottom of the ladder looming ahead. I scrambled up it so fast I'm surprised I didn't slip and fall. I burst out of the trap door, slamming it shut behind me. Without stopping to think, I grabbed my bag and ran out of the room, not even bothering to close the door. I sprinted to my car, fumbling with the keys as I tried to unlock it. Just as I heard voices shouting from the direction of my room, I managed to wrench the door open, throw myself inside, and peel out of the parking lot with a screech of tires. I drove for hours, putting as much distance between myself and that motel as possible. My mind was reeling, trying to process what I'd seen, some kind of criminal operation using the motel as a front, human trafficking, drug smuggling. I didn't know, and I didn't want to know. Part of me wanted to go to the police, but who would believe such a wild story? And what if these people had connections in law enforcement? I was too scared to risk it, so I just kept driving, watching my rearview mirror for headlights following me. It's been a week now, and I still have trouble sleeping. Every noise makes me jump. I keep expecting to see those men from the tunnel coming to silence me. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe in a motel again. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I look at the mud caked on my shoes and I know it was real. There are dark things hiding beneath the surface of our world, secret places where evil thrives, and I got a glimpse behind the curtain. I don't know what will happen next, but I do know one thing. I'm sticking to well-lit, crowded hotels from now on, and I'll be checking under the carpet just to be safe.